The KYLLIKKI Saari case begins on a pale Finnish road where you guide a bicycle through the cool evening air of Isojoki in the spring of 1953. Settle into the quiet now, because nothing in this old file needs to be hurried. The gravel feels loose beneath the tires, and the remaining daylight rests softly between the pines. Somewhere behind you, a schoolhouse is growing silent after a Sunday gathering, while somewhere ahead, beyond several miles of empty road, a farmhouse lamp waits in a familiar window. This is where we open the file. Beside that fading country light, you can place the first photograph beneath your lamp, its surface smooth in some places and faintly worn in others. KYLLIKKI Saari is 17 years old, with a composed expression and the ordinary hopes of someone whose life is still taking shape. She lives with her family in KYLLIKKI, a small community within the rural municipality of Isojoki in western Finland, of country life. As you study the picture, it helps to remember that the KYLLIKKI Saari case began with a real family, noticing an empty place at home. The Finland around her is still finding its balance after the war years, although daily life has become steadier by the spring of 1953. Coffee is available again, bicycles are common, and electricity is reaching more rural homes, though many evenings still depend upon oil lamps and wood-burning stoves. You can almost smell the dry split logs stacked near a kitchen wall, mixed with bread, soap, and damp wool. Roads between villages remain narrow and lightly traveled, with pale gravel at the center and dark ditches on either side. In such a place, distance is measured not only in miles, but in weather, effort, and daylight. KYLLIKKI works as an office assistant in the parish office, where paper records, ink, and careful handwriting shape the rhythm of each day. You can imagine the quiet room, the faint scratch of a pen, and the soft closing of a wooden drawer containing baptismal records or notices. Her work asks for order and patience, qualities that would later make the disorder surrounding her disappearance feel especially difficult to those who knew her. She is remembered as religious, conscientious, and reserved, though no young person can ever be contained completely within a few remembered words. As we turn the page, we should leave room for the ordinary privacy that belonged to her. That privacy would become harder to protect once the case drew national attention, because almost every action in KYLLIKKI's short life would eventually be inspected for meaning. Old conversations were recalled, private worries were repeated, and passing changes in mood were treated as possible clues. You can feel how fragile memory becomes under that kind of attention, when a witness searches backward through weeks and tries to decide whether a quiet expression had been unusual. What seemed ordinary before the disappearance could appear significant afterward. This is one of the first reasons the investigation became so difficult, because hindsight placed a heavy shadow across memories formed in harmless light. On Sunday, the 17th of May, KYLLIKKI prepares to attend a religious youth gathering at the village school in KYLLIKKI. The journey from her home is roughly 12 kilometers, a manageable distance by bicycle in that place and time. You can picture her checking the tires, adjusting her clothing, and setting off while the spring air still carries warmth from the afternoon. The road passes farms, fields, and wooded stretches where the resinous smell of pine settles close to the ground. Nothing about such a journey would have seemed remarkable, and that very ordinariness would later trouble investigators more than any dramatic detail could. The gathering is held inside a country schoolhouse, a practical wooden building familiar to the young people who attend. Perhaps the room smells faintly of chalk dust, varnished desks, and coats recently brought in from the evening air. Voices rise gently during conversation and then settle as the devotional meeting proceeds. You sit with this portion of the file and notice how little survives of those hours, because no one present had reason to memorize them. People remembered KYLLIKKI being there, yet they weren't watching her as witnesses then. They were simply sharing a Sunday evening, surrounded by the familiar sounds of neighbors and friends. KYLLIKKI leaves after 10 o'clock with her friend KYLLIKKI, and the two young women begin cycling together. Their lamps would have cast modest pools of light upon the gravel, though the northern spring evening had not yet become entirely dark. You can hear the small metallic rhythm of bicycle chains, the soft hiss of tires, and an occasional bird calling from the trees. For part of the route, companionship makes the distance easier. The friends travel toward the place known as the Dairy Crossroads, where their ways home will divide. We follow them slowly, because this shared stretch is the last part of KYLLIKKI's journey, supported by a certain account. At the Dairy Crossroads, reached at around 10:30, Maiju turns toward her own destination, while KYLLIKKI continues toward Heikkilä. About 7 kilometers still separate KYLLIKKI from home, and most of that distance follows a gravel road bordered by forest. You can pause at the junction in your mind, where one bicycle moves away in one direction and the other enters the quiet road ahead. There is no need to make the moment ominous, because it wasn't understood that way at the time. It was simply a familiar parting between friends, accompanied by cool air and the fading sound of a wheel moving over stone. The road beyond the crossroads runs through a landscape of pine, wet ground, scattered farms, and long spaces without houses. In May, the ditches hold dark water, and the forest floor remains cool even when the daytime sun has warmed the fields. You can imagine the scent of damp moss rising beside the road, and the slight pressure of evening cold against your hands. KYLLIKKI had traveled rural roads before, as nearly everyone in the district had. A bicycle offered independence, especially in a place where buses were limited and private cars remained uncommon. The route was lonely, but loneliness itself was part of the local geography, not necessarily a warning. Investigators later worked to determine whether anyone saw KYLLIKKI after the friends separated. One reported sighting placed a young cyclist farther along the road, perhaps about 10 minutes after the parting, but every remembered minute introduced uncertainty. You can lay the statements side by side and notice the small differences that appear whenever people estimate time without consulting a clock. One person remembers the color of clothing, another the position of a bicycle, while someone else recalls only movement in the evening light. These accounts offer direction, yet none recorded the decisive moment. The last reliable portion of the timeline therefore ended with an ordinary farewell at a rural crossroads. At the Saari farmhouse, the night lengthens without KYLLIKKI's return. Her family doesn't immediately assume that something terrible has happened, because there are reasonable possibilities in a close rural community. She might have stayed with her friend, perhaps because the hour had grown late, or because riding home alone seemed unnecessary. You can feel how families often protect themselves with simple explanations during the first uncertain hours. The stove cools, the rooms become still, and the expected sound of a bicycle never reaches the yard. Yet concern at first arrives gradually, like a draft beneath a door rather than as a sudden alarm. Monday brings farm work, household tasks, and the continued belief that KYLLIKKI's whereabouts may soon be explained. Communication in rural Finland is not immediate, and checking with another household takes effort. There are no mobile telephones, no instant messages, and no shared digital record that can reveal a person's movements. You might have to walk, cycle, visit a neighbor, or wait for access to a telephone. Each small delay feels understandable by itself. Together, however, those delays consume the earliest hours, when tracks remain clear and recollections remain fresh. The investigation that will eventually become enormous begins with this quiet and entirely human problem of distance. By Tuesday evening, the 19th of May, KYLLIKKI's father reports her missing to the local authorities. 2 days have passed since she left the youth gathering, and the road has continued its usual life beneath carts, bicycles, boots, and changing weather. You can imagine an officer opening a notebook, pressing his pencil to the paper, and asking for the familiar sequence of questions. What was she wearing? Where was she going? Who saw her? And when was she expected home? These are sensible questions, but the answers now lead backward through nearly 48 hours. The first great obstacle in the KYLLIKKI Saari case is therefore not indifference, but lost time. That lost time matters greatly on a gravel road, where evidence is delicate and temporary. Tire impressions can be softened by traffic, footprints can overlap, and a brief shower can turn precise edges into shapeless marks. You kneel beside the imagined roadside with the investigators and feel the coarse grit beneath your fingertips. There is no sealed scene waiting for specialists, because no one yet knows where the relevant scene might be. The possible area stretches for kilometers through forest, ditches, marshland, and narrow tracks. Before any object can be treated as evidence, the searchers must first decide where the final known journey actually ended. Local police begin searching on Wednesday, the 20th of May, with roughly 30 men assisting in the area near the route. Their boots press into damp earth, and branches brush against wool coats and work clothes as they move through the trees. You can hear voices carrying between searchers, sometimes close and sometimes softened by the forest. The work requires patient attention, because a misplaced object may be small and the landscape is wide. Yet search methods in 1953 depend heavily on sight, local knowledge, and physical endurance. There are no aerial thermal cameras, satellite maps, or electronic tracers, only people moving slowly through ground they believe they know. The volunteers examine roadside spaces, patches of forest, ditches, and places where a bicycle might have left the road. Many of them know KYLLIKKI, know her family, or recognize the routes she traveled. That closeness brings determination, but it can also shape expectations. You naturally look where you believe a person would go, and you sometimes pass over places that seem too familiar or too unlikely. Searchers must judge mud, crushed grass, broken twigs, and countless marks made by ordinary rural work. The same local landscape that helps them navigate also encourages assumptions, because familiarity can make a hidden place seem transparent when it isn't. The countryside itself complicates everything. Around Isojoki, forest and bog lie close to worked land, and drainage ditches divide areas that appear simple from a road. Wet ground can swallow impressions, while low vegetation conceals shallow depressions. You can feel cool moisture gathering around your boots as you step from firm soil onto moss that moves slightly beneath your weight. A person standing on the road might see only trees, brush, and an unbroken green surface. Several hundred meters away, the ground can become entirely different. This quiet variety gives the searchers too much territory and too few fixed points, and the file begins to widen into possibility. Reports soon emerge about vehicles seen in the wider area, including a light-colored car noticed along the road on the evening KYLLIKKI disappeared. Cars are still uncommon enough in rural districts that they draw attention, yet descriptions remain uncertain. You can unfold the witness statement and see how little a person may retain from a passing automobile. A pale body, a shape, perhaps occupants, perhaps an unusual position near the roadside. Different makes resemble one another at dusk, and colors change beneath weak light. A cream car may appear gray, beige, or almost white, depending upon distance and memory. It becomes a lead, but never a firmly identified object. Other accounts speak of roadside movement, possible tire marks, and marks left near a stack of cut wood. Each detail seems capable of pointing somewhere, yet none exists alone in a protected chain of evidence. You can imagine investigators returning to the same stretch, measuring distances and asking witnesses to stand where they had stood before. Gravel shifts beneath each passing wheel, while the spring weather quietly alters the shoulder of the road. A mark observed on Monday may not be documented until later, and no one can prove exactly when it was made. The case gathers fragments, but the fragments resist becoming a single picture. This is where patient detective work can feel both practical and strangely philosophical. You record what people say, compare times, revisit locations, and hope that separate recollections will overlap cleanly. Yet human memory doesn't behave like ink on official paper. It changes as people speak with neighbors, read newspaper reports, and hear the theories circulating through the community. We can sit with the investigators as they recognize that every new conversation may reveal something useful, while also altering what a witness believes they originally knew. The search for information begins to affect the information itself, a slow complication that enters the KYLLIKKI Saari file almost immediately. The disappearance attracts attention beyond Isojoki, and that attention grows as the days pass without an answer. Newspaper pages carry KYLLIKKI's photograph, while radio reports bring her name into homes far from the district. You can hear paper rustling over breakfast tables and the low hum of a radio near a kitchen window. Public concern helps expand the search, and many people sincerely want to assist. At the same time, national attention brings guesses, rumors, and stories from people with no direct knowledge. The investigators receive more material than their small organization can easily sort, and the difference between a clue and a notion becomes harder to preserve. Every report must still be considered, because dismissing the right one could close the only useful path. An unfamiliar man seen days earlier, a car heard at an uncertain hour, or a remark repeated in a shop might deserve inquiry. You can watch the paper accumulating on a desk, each sheet bearing a name, a date, and someone's recollection. The pages smell of ink and office dust, and their edges begin to curl beneath repeated handling. Some statements overlap, while others point in opposite directions. Patient investigation requires humility here, because you cannot yet know which page matters, and the weight of all those pages creates its own confusion. The authorities also must consider whether KYLLIKKI left voluntarily, suffered an accident, or met someone she knew. These possibilities aren't dramatic theories. They are the basic branches of any missing person inquiry. You trace each branch with a finger and notice how quickly it divides again. If she left voluntarily, what did she take, and whom might she contact? If she had an accident, where could she and the bicycle have gone unseen? If another person became involved, was that meeting planned or unexpected? The absence of KYLLIKKI's personal belongings, bicycle, and body allows several explanations to survive, and uncertainty becomes the investigation's central condition. Her family waits while these questions multiply. There are chores to perform, animals to tend, meals to prepare, and neighbors arriving with concern that cannot provide an answer. You can imagine the familiar rooms taking on a different feel, because every object associated with KYLLIKKI now seems to point toward her absence. A folded garment, a place at the table, or a task she usually completed carries a quiet charge. The family's experience shouldn't be reduced to the public mystery that later formed around the case. For them, it was first the waiting for a daughter and sister to cross the threshold, a deeply personal form of patience no family chooses. As the search continues, investigators begin learning more about KYLLIKKI's work at the parish office and the people around her there. Private matters enter official notes, some relevant and some impossible to assess. The parish had recently undergone a change in leadership, and attention eventually turned toward a former clergyman who had moved away shortly before the disappearance. You can feel the file becoming more delicate at this point, because an institution associated with trust now appears within a criminal inquiry. Investigators must separate verified conduct, workplace relationships, rumor, and opportunity. These categories often arrive tangled together, especially when a community is already speaking in whispers. Evidence later established that the former clergyman had behaved improperly toward KYLLIKKI, an abuse of trust that deserved serious examination. Police studied his movements during the evening of the 17th of May and continued considering him for years. Yet suspicion and proof remained different things. He was living roughly 60 kilometers away, lacked his own car and driving license, and most of his evening could be accounted for. You can place the timelines beside one another and see that a narrow interval remained uncertain. But it didn't offer a practical journey to Isojoki and back. The line demanded attention, though it never produced a factual connection to KYLLIKKI's disappearance. This distinction is essential when we read an old case file. A person may have harmed someone in one setting without being responsible for every later harm associated with that person. Investigators had to examine the clergyman carefully, yet public discussion sometimes moved faster than evidence. You can hear how a troubling fact becomes joined to an unanswered question, simply because people want the question settled. Once a name becomes widely repeated, other leads may receive less attention. The KYLLIKKI Saari case began going cold partly because strong suspicion gathered around people who could neither be conclusively linked nor fully removed from public memory. Meanwhile, the physical search remains exhausting and repetitive. Parties walk through undergrowth, inspect waterways, and revisit sections already considered, sometimes in rain and sometimes beneath clear summer light. You feel the season changing around them as fresh leaves darken and the days lengthen. Insects gather near wet ground, boots become muddy, and the smell of crushed fern follows the searchers home. Large searches create confidence that an area has been covered, but coverage is never perfect. People grow tired, lines drift apart, and a shallow concealment can remain unnoticed beneath vegetation that appears completely ordinary. Weeks pass, and the early confidence that KYLLIKKI will soon be found begins to fade. Police continue interviews while letters and telephone calls arrive from across Finland. Some writers offer sincere observations, while others report dreams or visions, believing they can identify a location through intuition. You can imagine an officer reading each page beneath a desk lamp, knowing that compassion requires care even when a claim seems unlikely. False confessions also enter the record, offered for reasons that may include illness, attention, confusion, or private distress. Each one consumes time, and every hour spent disproving an invention is an hour unavailable for a more grounded lead. The eventual investigation would contain thousands of pages and hundreds of separate lines of inquiry. That abundance sounds like strength, but information can become a burden when it arrives faster than it can be tested. You lift an imaginary folder, and feel how the cardboard bends under the weight of statements, reports, maps, and laboratory notes. Somewhere inside may be a useful observation, though it sits beside many claims that cannot be verified. Detectives must build indexes, compare names, and remember connections across months of work. In the 1950s, all of this depends upon paper, handwriting, typewriters, and human attention. There is another difficulty in the changing scale of the inquiry. What begins as a local missing persons search gradually becomes a nationally watched homicide investigation. But procedures suitable for one stage don't always protect evidence needed in the next. At first, searchers hope to find KYLLIKKI alive or injured, so speed and coverage matter more than preserving every footprint. Later, objects must be treated as possible exhibits, though many have already been touched, moved, washed, or exposed. You can see how no single decision seems unreasonable in its original moment. The weakness emerges only afterward, when modern questions are asked of material collected for a different purpose. Summer comes to Isojoki, softening the wet margins of the roads with grasses and small flowers. The original tire marks have long since vanished, and the earth has absorbed the traces of spring traffic. You return to the route with the investigators and notice how the light now falls differently through fuller branches. A place remembered from May no longer looks quite the same in June. Witnesses may point to a bend or tree and discover that distance is difficult to judge after many weeks. Time changes landscapes as gently as it changes recollection, and both transformations make the truth harder to locate. Searches extend into boggy ground and small bodies of water, because a bicycle should be large enough to find, yet no bicycle has appeared. This absence puzzles the searchers. If KYLLIKKI left the road accidentally, the bicycle might lie near her. If she went elsewhere voluntarily, she might have taken it. You can hear the practical reasoning behind each search decision, even when it leads nowhere. A bicycle is metal, paint, rubber, and shape, more visible than a dropped purse or book. Its disappearance suggests deliberate concealment, though until it is found, even that remains an inference. On the 22nd of July, more than 2 months after KYLLIKKI vanished, the bicycle is discovered in a muddy hollow at Lellulaakso. The place lies within the wider search area, concealed by marshy ground and vegetation. You stand at its edge in your imagination, where brown water reflects broken pieces of sky and the mud releases a rich, earthy smell. When the bicycle is raised, water runs from the frame and gathers beneath it. The object is immediately familiar, yet its condition introduces new questions. At last the investigation has something solid to examine, something carrying both the comfort and burden of proof. The valves have been removed from the tires, apparently making the bicycle easier to submerge. This small act suggests time, intention, and at least some practical thought. You can picture an investigator turning the wheel carefully, examining the rims, frame, pedals, and places where hands may have touched. But fingerprint recovery from an object submerged for weeks in muddy water offers little hope, especially with the methods then available. Water, soil, rust, and handling have altered the surfaces. The bicycle confirms concealment, but it cannot tell police who performed it, when it happened, or whether the same person was responsible for KYLLIKKI's death. Its location also raises a troubling question about the earlier searches. The bicycle had been hidden within a landscape examined repeatedly, yet it remained unseen until midsummer. You can look back through the notes and understand how this occurred without accusing the searchers of carelessness. Marshland is deceptive. Vegetation thickens quickly, and dark water hides objects only inches below the surface. Search parties may pass close to something while seeing nothing unusual. Still, the discovery demonstrates that other evidence could also remain nearby, quietly concealed in ground already crossed. Confidence in the completeness of the search begins to weaken. Investigators now reconsider the relationship between the roadside, the bicycle's hiding place, and the route toward KYLLIKKI's home. Distances are measured again, paths are walked again, and local knowledge becomes newly important. Whoever concealed the bicycle may have understood the marshy hollow, or may simply have noticed it from the road. You can hold both possibilities without choosing between them. Familiarity with the terrain might indicate a local person, yet rural workers, travelers, and road crews also knew such places. Each reasonable conclusion has a reasonable alternative, and this symmetry will follow the KYLLIKKI Saari investigation for decades. The bicycle doesn't explain what happened to KYLLIKKI's other belongings. Her purse, wristwatch, hymn book, and several items of clothing remain missing, while the search for her continues. You can make a careful list in the margin, not as a dramatic inventory, but as a record of absences that might someday matter. Personal objects can travel far from the central scene, be discarded separately, or remain hidden in a building. They can also be destroyed without leaving a record. Because none of these items is recovered, investigators lose possible fingerprints, fibers, soil traces, and associations that later science might have examined with greater precision. By late summer, the case has become a daily presence in Isojoki, even when no new evidence appears. People recognize investigators' vehicles, discuss search areas, and repeat the latest reports in shops and kitchens. You can smell coffee warming on a stove, while the same questions pass around a table once more. Did someone see a stranger? Was a particular car in the district? And why had the bicycle been placed there? Repetition can keep a case alive, but it can also harden uncertain claims into accepted local history. A story repeated often enough begins to feel remembered, even to people who first heard it from someone else. This is one of the quieter mechanisms by which a case grows cold. It doesn't always happen because leads disappear entirely. Sometimes too many imperfect leads gather around the facts. You return to the witness statements and find people influenced by newspaper accounts, neighborhood talk, and the passage of months. A pale automobile acquires a precise make, an uncertain time becomes exact, and a vague figure develops recognizable features. Investigators must decide whether this new detail is genuine memory or later addition. Without recordings of the earliest interviews, they depend upon notes whose brief sentences may not preserve a witness's original hesitation. The police also face the limits of forensic science in 1953. Blood typing exists. Fingerprints are well established, and laboratories can study fibers, soil, hair, and tool marks. But the smallest biological traces cannot yet identify an individual. Genetic profiling lies decades in the future. You can imagine evidence technicians working with glass slides, magnifying instruments, paper envelopes, and careful handwritten labels. Their methods are serious, yet preservation standards reflect the questions their era knows how to ask. No one can protect every surface for a technology that hasn't been invented, and the future usefulness of an object remains invisible. Chain of custody is another phrase that appears simple until you follow an object through a crowded investigation. A volunteer finds something, a local officer receives it, another person transports it, and laboratory staff prepare it for examination. You can trace each transfer in the margins, though some movements were never documented fully. Objects may be placed on a table, shown to reporters, or handled before their significance is understood. None of this necessarily reflects bad faith. It reflects an era, an overwhelming case, and procedures still developing. Decades later, however, every undocumented touch becomes a reason that a scientific result may lack meaning. As August gives way to September, the countryside takes on another texture. Mornings cool, the grasses lose some brightness, and mist gathers over wet ground before lifting. Searchers can revisit areas once concealed by dense summer growth, but fatigue now accompanies every effort. You walk with them along the quiet road and feel the weight of weeks without an answer. A missing person search depends partly on hope, and hope changes when time passes. It doesn't vanish, though it becomes more careful, carrying the knowledge that whatever is found may not be what the family has been waiting to receive. Newspaper interest continues to press against the investigation. Reporters seek developments, photographs, names, and explanations, while the public expects steady progress from work that is often repetitive and private. You can hear a typewriter striking in an adjoining room as another account is prepared for publication. Publicity brings volunteers and information, but it may also reveal details that investigators would prefer to keep confidential. Once a fact becomes widely known, a false confessor can repeat it convincingly. The distinction between knowledge held by the responsible person and knowledge learned from the press becomes increasingly blurred. Names of possible suspects circulate with little restraint, sometimes appearing in print before evidence has been adequately tested. For those individuals and their families, the investigation becomes a second form of uncertainty. You can hold compassion for KYLLIKKI while also recognizing the damage caused by unsupported accusation. A person may behave strangely, have a poor reputation, or tell an unwise joke without being responsible for the disappearance. Yet in a frightened community, oddness can be mistaken for guilt. Detectives must examine conduct without allowing dislike to replace proof, a discipline made harder by the public hunger for one answer. Among the local men considered was a 38-year-old laborer who lived within a few kilometers of the eventual burial place. He knew the terrain and worked on drainage ditches in the area after KYLLIKKI disappeared. You can picture the ditch crew resting near wet ground, their shovels carrying the smell of iron and peat. At that stage, the location held no known significance, because KYLLIKKI had not yet been found. Only later would the proximity appear extraordinary. Investigators then had to ask whether it showed familiarity and opportunity, or whether ordinary rural work had placed a local man near the site by chance. Several women later reported troubling behavior by this man, and witnesses recalled remarks suggesting he knew something about the case. His family supplied an alibi for the evening, though police questioned its reliability. You can feel how suspicion tightens around a person when separate concerns begin to point in the same direction. Yet suspicion still needs physical evidence, a reliable confession, or a witness who can place him at a decisive location. None of those arrived. His statements could be interpreted as hints, boasts, evasions, or simply reckless speech, and each interpretation depended upon the listener's expectation. The man would eventually become the strongest local suspect in the eyes of many investigators, but he never admitted responsibility. No preserved fingerprint, fiber, or other technical result connected him to KYLLIKKI or her bicycle. You can place his file beside the others and see both why detectives returned to him and why prosecutors could not proceed. A doubtful alibi is not proof, troubling behavior is not proof, and proximity is not proof. Patient detective work requires living with that distinction, even when instinct insists that the answer is close. The law asks for evidence capable of surviving scrutiny, not simply a persuasive feeling. In early October, the search enters a season of thinning leaves and colder ground. Forestry work and renewed examination bring people again into the area near the road between Isojoki and Kauhajoki. You can hear an axe or tool moving through brush, followed by the soft fall of branches onto damp soil. The landscape that had hidden its details through summer begins to open slightly. Brown needles cover the ground, and the smell of peat grows stronger beneath cool air. Almost 5 months have passed since the Sunday evening ride, and the investigation's paper record is large, while its physical evidence remains small. On the 10th of October, during work in the forest, one of KYLLIKKI's shoes is discovered. It lies close enough to the later burial place to redirect attention toward a patch of boggy ground previously overlooked. You can imagine the sudden stillness that follows the recognition of an ordinary personal object in an unexpected place. The shoe is weathered by months outside, its surface carrying soil and moisture rather than a clear account of how it arrived. Searchers begin looking more carefully nearby. Once again, the case changes because someone notices something modest, not through a dramatic breakthrough, but through patient looking. The next morning, on the 11th of October, a searcher pulls at a small pine sapling that appears unusual atop a mound. The sapling comes loose, revealing that its base has been sharpened and placed deliberately into the earth. You can feel the rough bark against a work-worn palm and smell the dark, wet soil disturbed beneath it. Under the covering of moss and peat, searchers find KYLLIKKI. We needn't remain with the physical details, because the important fact for the investigation is simple and quiet. The long search for her whereabouts has ended, while the search for the person responsible has entered a much more difficult phase. The burial place lies only a few hundred meters from the road, and not far from the hollow where the bicycle had been found. Searchers, workers, and residents had moved through the surrounding area for months, sometimes passing remarkably close. You stand beside the map with investigators and trace the short distances in pencil. The closeness feels almost impossible until you remember the density of vegetation, the uneven bog, and the concealment beneath moss. Finding KYLLIKKI so near the suspected point of disappearance confirms the importance of the original route, but it also exposes how much time and evidence have been lost to the seasons. Near the burial place, investigators find the second shoe and a torn portion of a man's sock placed inside it. Dark yarn has been wound around the cloth, and part of the sock bears a rough repair. You can picture the evidence laid carefully on plain paper beneath a strong lamp, still carrying the faint smell of wet earth. Laboratory staff will examine the cut, the stitching, the fibers, and the color, searching for some feature that leads to an owner. The object seems intimate and specific, exactly the kind of detail a detective hopes will narrow the field. Instead, it will become one of the case's most persistent questions. The sock appears to have been cut with a sharp tool while compressed, and the repair suggests ordinary hand sewing rather than professional work. Investigators consider whether it belonged to the person who concealed KYLLIKKI, whether it served some practical purpose, or whether it arrived through another chain of events. You turn the fragment gently within the language of the report, careful not to give it more certainty than it holds. Its matching half is never found, and no owner is identified. A clue without context can remain eloquent, yet useless, preserving evidence of someone's presence without explaining whose presence it was. By the time these objects are collected, many people have visited or worked near the area. Searchers gather quickly, curious residents approach, and news of the discovery travels outward. You can hear footsteps pressing into wet ground and voices held low beneath the trees. Modern investigators would establish a broad perimeter, photograph every surface systematically, and record each person entering the site. In 1953, the response reflects different training equipment, and public expectations. Valuable work is still done, but the scene can't be sealed from all disturbance. Every additional footprint quietly reduces the clarity of the ground. The condition of KYLLIKKI's remains after nearly 5 months limits what medical examination can establish with confidence. Investigators can determine that her death wasn't natural, but certain details about cause, sequence, and motive remain uncertain. We can leave the medical language folded inside its envelope and focus on what that uncertainty means. Without a precise account, detectives cannot reliably distinguish among several possible events that might have occurred on the road. An assault, an unintended death during an encounter, or another chain of actions may fit portions of the evidence. The body answers some questions, yet time has softened many of its answers. This uncertainty matters because motive helps investigators sort suspects. If the evidence clearly identifies a particular kind of encounter, police can focus on people with relevant opportunity or prior behavior. Here, however, missing clothing and personal items suggest possibilities without proving them. You can see the detectives resisting conclusions, while newspapers and neighbors make conclusions of their own. The absence of certainty leaves room for theories involving strangers, local men, vehicles, accidents, concealment, and assistance after the fact. Each theory may explain one detail, but none explains every detail without asking us to make an unsupported assumption. The recovery of KYLLIKKI also changes the emotional atmosphere throughout Finland. The hope attached to a missing person search gives way to mourning, while public attention grows larger still. In Isojoki, the church prepares for a funeral that will draw people from across the country. You can imagine autumn coats brushing together, damp shoes on stone, and a low murmur passing through an immense gathering. Estimates place the attendance near 25,000, several times the population of the municipality. Many have never met KYLLIKKI, yet they arrive because her photograph and absence have entered the national conscience. For the family, this public mourning must coexist with private grief and the continued presence of investigators. Questions remain about KYLLIKKI's movements, relationships, worries, and belongings. You can feel how exhausting it must be to repeat intimate information while strangers gather outside and newspapers print new speculation. Compassion requires us to remember that public fascination doesn't lessen private pain. The case may belong to history now, but KYLLIKKI belonged first to people who knew her voice, her habits, and the sound of her bicycle entering the yard. That human closeness remains the quiet center of every page we turn. After the funeral, investigators face a different kind of task. The search area has produced a body, a bicycle, 2 shoes, a pine sapling, and a fragment of sock, but months have passed since the relevant night. You return with them to the beginning and rebuild the timeline yet again. Who knew KYLLIKKI's route? Who traveled the road? Who had access to a vehicle? And who understood the boggy ground near Lellulaakso? The same questions now carry greater weight, while the evidence available to answer them has grown older. The investigation becomes less about searching widely and more about testing each surviving story. Interrogations expand, and the number of investigative paths eventually reaches several hundred. Each path has its own folder, names, dates, and small uncertainties. You can almost feel the dry warmth of an interview room, hear a clock above the door, and smell tobacco lingering in a wool coat. Some people answer steadily, while others contradict themselves for reasons that may have nothing to do with guilt. Fear, shame, poor memory, and distrust of authority can all make truthful people appear uncertain. Detectives must listen for inconsistency without assuming that inconsistency always reveals deception. The local laborer remains a central subject of inquiry because of his proximity, his knowledge of the terrain, and the concerns reported by women. Police arrest him in October and examine his account closely. You sit with the interview notes and notice how frustrating the gap between suspicion and proof can become. An investigator may believe a person knows more than he says, yet belief cannot supply a missing witness or laboratory result. The man's relatives maintain his alibi, and no confession follows. He is released without charge, leaving the strongest theory suspended in the uncomfortable space between probability and evidence. Other suspects enter the file from farther away. Travelers, former officials, men with cars, and people known for troubling behavior are each considered. Some appear because a witness recalls a face, others because someone makes an accusation, and still others because their movements seem uncertain. You can follow these lines across maps of Western Finland, with road distances marked in pencil and times compared against train schedules or household testimony. Most leads gradually weaken under examination, yet every disproved lead consumes days or weeks, and the growing file becomes a record not only of what might have happened, but of everything that didn't. As winter settles over Isojoki, the roads harden and the bog disappears beneath snow. The physical landscape can no longer be searched in the same way, and investigators turn more heavily toward interviews and documents. You can hear a stove ticking in an office while wind moves against the window, and the typewriter continues its deliberate rhythm. Statements are copied, reports forwarded, and names compared. Outside, the place where KYLLIKKI was found becomes white and still, preserving no visible trace of the autumn activity. Inside, the case remains active, though each passing week draws it farther from the night that investigators are trying to reconstruct. And when the next folder is drawn from the cabinet, we find that the cold didn't arrive all at once, because it gathered slowly through fragile evidence, competing suspicions, and memories that changed each time they were brought back into the light. I'll carry the file forward through the early suspect work and the decades of re-examination, keeping the same restrained cadence and factual care. Within that light, the paper doesn't become clearer so much as more crowded, because every witness brings a separate angle to the same quiet road. You find statements written in formal language, though the voices behind them belonged to farmers, laborers, shopkeepers, drivers, and young people trying to be precise. Some had checked a clock, while others measured time by a meal, a radio program, or the fading daylight. We sit beside the detectives as they compare these accounts, knowing that a difference of 10 minutes might matter greatly. The trouble is that memory rarely keeps such exactness for an evening that seemed ordinary. A witness may remember passing a cyclist, yet remain unsure whether the rider was KYLLIKKI or another young woman on a similar bicycle. Another may recall a car beside the road, although its make, color, and direction become uncertain under questioning. You can almost hear the pause before each answer, and the quiet scrape of a chair against the interview room floor. The officers ask the same question in several ways, hoping that repetition will reveal a stable detail. Sometimes it does, but sometimes the answer shifts because the witness wishes to be helpful. In the KYLLIKKI Saari case, goodwill often created as much noise as clarity. The interviews also reveal how many people used the road during different parts of that Sunday evening. Milk transport, farm work, visits between homes, and journeys between villages all placed ordinary travelers nearby. You trace their routes across a paper map whose folds have softened through handling, and you notice that every line crosses another somewhere. A person might have been close to the dairy crossroads at 1 hour and several kilometers away at the next. Without precise clocks or written travel records, these movements remain approximate. The road was lonely enough to feel isolated, yet busy enough to leave investigators with a crowd of uncertain possibilities. Among the details repeatedly examined were marks reportedly seen near the roadside on the morning after KYLLIKKI disappeared. Tire tracks, bicycle impressions, and signs of footwear were noticed near a stack of wood, but they weren't preserved as a modern crime scene team would preserve them. You can crouch beside that imagined verge and feel loose grit moving beneath your palm. By the time their possible importance became clear, traffic and weather had already changed the surface. Photographs and measurements could record what remained, though they couldn't restore what had vanished. The first hours had carried the sharpest traces, and those hours were already gone. Investigators considered whether a vehicle had stopped there, perhaps forcing KYLLIKKI from the road, or becoming involved through an accident. The light-colored car described by witnesses offered one possible connection, and inquiries spread through registration lists, garages, and nearby towns. You can smell petrol and cold metal inside a rural workshop as an officer asks about repairs, dents, or a customer who arrived unexpectedly. Mechanics search their memories, while owners explain where they had traveled on the 17th of May. Most vehicles are eventually accounted for or prove unrelated. Yet the pale car never settles into one verified identity, remaining a moving shape at the edge of the file. The possibility of an accident has a certain practical appeal, because it might explain a stopped car, a hidden bicycle, and a decision made in fear. But every theory must be tested against the burial place, the missing belongings, and the deliberate concealment. You can follow the reasoning without accepting it, as detectives did for many years. If a driver panicked, why choose that patch of bog, and how was it found in the evening darkness? If several people were involved, why did none provide a reliable account later? A theory can sound complete when spoken quickly, yet its quiet spaces often contain the most difficult questions. Another possibility was that someone local approached KYLLIKKI on foot or from a nearby home, knowing both her routine and the landscape. This idea drew attention toward men living along the road and those employed on nearby drainage work. You can unfold a district map and mark each residence with a careful pencil dot. The result seems to narrow the inquiry. But rural proximity is deceptive, because many people live within cycling or walking distance. A local person may know the marsh, though so may a road worker or frequent traveler. Familiarity is important, but it doesn't identify the individual who possessed it. The 38-year-old ditch digger remained central because several pieces of circumstance gathered around him. He lived near the area, knew the ground, and later worked almost beside the concealed burial place, without drawing attention to it. Women described earlier encounters that made investigators take him seriously, and some witnesses believed his remarks hinted at private knowledge. You can imagine the detectives returning to his statements, underlining a phrase, and then comparing it with something said weeks later. But ambiguous speech is difficult evidence. A boast, a threat, a drunken remark, and a confession can sound similar once reduced to a single sentence. His relatives said that he had been at home and asleep after drinking on the evening KYLLIKKI vanished. Family alibis aren't automatically false, though they require careful testing because loyalty can shape what people remember or choose to say. You sit with the interview records and notice that domestic time is often loosely kept. Someone recalls supper, another recalls darkness, and another remembers checking on him without noting the hour. The accounts may support one another while still lacking an independent point of reference. Police doubted the alibi, but doubt couldn't establish where he had actually been during the crucial interval. There were also reports that the man had troubled KYLLIKKI during an earlier journey, perhaps while she traveled home from work in winter. Such information gave investigators a possible prior connection, although later retellings sometimes made the encounter sound more certain than the surviving records allow. You can feel the temptation to treat an earlier concern as the missing key. Yet, a responsible reading keeps each claim at its documented strength. If KYLLIKKI had reason to avoid him, that mattered, but it still didn't place him on the road that Sunday. The KYLLIKKI Saari case repeatedly approached this border between meaningful background and conclusive evidence. During questioning, the ditch digger sometimes behaved erratically, and his mental condition complicated efforts to interpret his words. Statements made under distress may contain truth, fantasy, defiance, or fragments of each. You can hear the low voice of a doctor advising that an interview should pause, while papers remain unfinished on the table. Investigators were searching for knowledge only the responsible person would possess, but reports about the case were already widespread. Even a striking remark might have come from rumor, newspapers, or conversation near the search sites. His behavior strengthened suspicion, yet it never created the kind of corroboration required for a charge. Attention also extended to his brother-in-law, who knew him well and might, investigators wondered, have helped conceal the bicycle or burial place. The idea of two people could explain how separate objects were moved, though it also added another person who would need to remain silent. You can place the two sets of statements side by side and look for matching gaps. Their movements, work, habits, and relationships are examined, but no physical trace binds either man to KYLLIKKI. A theory of assistance remains possible because the bicycle and burial site were separated. Still, possibility alone offers no bridge between suspicion and proof. Police searched properties, tools, clothing, and places associated with the men, hoping for a material connection. Soil might resemble soil from the bog, a tool might match a cut, or a missing garment might explain the sock fragment. You can feel the weight of a shovel as it is turned beneath better light, its wooden handle polished by years of use. Rural tools commonly carry peat, clay, rust, and plant matter, making broad similarities unsurprising. Without distinctive marks or controlled samples, comparison has limits. The ordinary materials of farm and drainage work surround everyone in the district, so the landscape itself refuses to point toward one owner. The sharpened pine sapling drew similar attention. Its cut surface suggested a tool, perhaps a knife or axe, but such tools were present in nearly every rural household. Investigators could study the angle and roughness of the cut, though microscopic tool mark comparison was less developed and the relevant tool remained unknown. You turn the preserved sapling beneath an imaginary lamp and notice its simple physical presence. It had marked the concealed place, whether intentionally or for some practical reason known only to the person who put it there. What looks highly distinctive at first can become less useful when its possible source is common. The grave itself appeared to show familiarity with ditching or peat ground, leading some officers to think of a person accustomed to digging. Yet almost every farm worker in Isojoki understood soil, drainage, and wetland. You can press a boot into the soft margin and recognize how experience would help someone choose firmer footing. The concealment required effort, though not necessarily specialist skill. Later writers would sometimes describe it as expertly made. while others saw hurried work hidden by vegetation. The physical feature remained the same, but interpretation shifted with the preferred suspect. This is how an old case can accumulate certainty without gaining new facts. Investigators returned repeatedly to the possibility that the person responsible and the person who concealed the belongings weren't the same. Perhaps one person caused KYLLIKKI's death and another helped afterward, or perhaps different objects were moved at different times. You can see why this idea appealed to detectives faced with the separated bicycle, burial place, and missing possessions. It might explain inconsistencies in time and behavior, but adding participants increases the number of assumptions and opportunities for disclosure. The file offers no firm proof of a helper, so the theory remains a tool for thinking rather than a recovered piece of history. This distinction between thinking tools and facts becomes increasingly important as the inquiry widens. Detectives construct possible sequences to test whether travel times, physical effort, and witness sightings can coexist. You follow one version from the roadside to the bog, then to the bicycle hollow, counting minutes and estimating visibility. Another version begins with a vehicle and requires a different route. Each reconstruction teaches something, even when it fails, yet none can be mistaken for what actually happened. The KYLLIKKI Saari case contains many plausible narratives, and their very plausibility sometimes hides how little they are supported by direct evidence. The former clergyman's timeline received the same patient treatment. Police checked his location, transportation options, household witnesses, and the duties that occupied him that evening. You can hear a distant church clock and imagine investigators comparing its hours with journey times along narrow roads. His prior misconduct toward KYLLIKKI made the inquiry necessary and deeply serious. Still, the practical route from Merikavia to Isojoki and back presented substantial difficulty, especially for someone without a car or driving license. Most of his evening was accounted for, and no witness placed him near KYLLIKKI's route. Suspicion remained emotionally powerful, but factually incomplete. For KYLLIKKI's family, these suspect lines must have carried a difficult mixture of hope and strain. Every arrest or newspaper claim might suggest that an answer was near, only for the evidence to dissolve under examination. You can imagine a paper arriving at the farmhouse, its headline larger than the facts beneath it. Neighbors may repeat what they have heard, while officers continue asking careful questions. A family in grief is asked to wait, not once, but repeatedly, through each promising theory. The human cost of a cold case lies partly in these unfinished beginnings, each one opening a door that never fully moves. False confessions added another layer to that cycle. Some people contacted police claiming responsibility, though their accounts failed when compared with details withheld from public reporting. You sit beside the investigator, who listens without ridicule, asking where the bicycle was placed, what route was taken, and what objects were present. The answers wander, contradict known facts, or repeat newspaper language. Each confession must nevertheless be checked, because occasionally a troubled or hesitant person does tell the truth indirectly. None of the confessions in the KYLLIKKI Saari case produced the hidden knowledge needed to make it credible. Other letters came from people who believed dreams had shown them the burial place or the responsible person. In an era when the case occupied national attention, such messages arrived in remarkable numbers. You can picture envelopes postmarked from distant towns, carrying carefully drawn maps, religious interpretations, or names unknown to the investigators. The paper may smell faintly of a household drawer or tobacco from the room where it was written. Police couldn't devote equal effort to every vision, Yet clerks still recorded and sorted much of the material. The result was a growing archive, where sincere concern and unsupported imagination rested in the same boxes. Some accusations were directed toward disliked neighbors or relatives. A disagreement over land, money, courtship, or reputation could suddenly be recast as information about the case. You read these statements slowly and notice how often the accusation reveals more about the writer's private conflict than about KYLLIKKI's disappearance. Investigators had to visit, interview, and verify, sometimes traveling considerable distances. Most reports ended with a short note explaining that no connection was found. Those brief endings conceal many hours of work. A cold investigation can be slowed not only by missing clues, but by the steady arrival of personal grievances wearing the shape of evidence. The press amplified certain theories because they offered recognizable characters and simple explanations. A clergyman, a troubled local worker, or mysterious men in a pale car could each support a compelling newspaper story. You can hear the printing presses beginning their mechanical rhythm long before dawn, while editors choose which details will appear above the fold. Nuance becomes difficult in that space. A person under inquiry may be described as though guilt is nearly established, and an uncertain sighting may become a firm encounter. Publicity kept KYLLIKKI's name visible, but it also made the investigative atmosphere more crowded. Film cameras arrived in Isojoki, recording the funeral, the landscape, and the official activity surrounding the case. For many Finnish viewers, these images created a lasting visual memory of the quiet road and the mourners gathered near the church. You can imagine the faint rattle of a film projector years later, its light flickering across a darkened room. Moving images carry authority, even when they show only what happened after the relevant night. The camera preserves faces and weather, not the missing event. Yet generations would come to feel that they had somehow seen the case itself, because its aftermath remained so visible. This national recognition changed how witnesses remembered their own involvement. A person who had offered a small observation could later become known as someone connected to a famous mystery. Over the years, retellings might become smoother, more detailed, and more confident. You return to the earliest statement whenever possible, because it usually stands closest to the original memory. Later interviews still matter, especially when someone withheld information through fear or shame, but they require a different kind of caution. The patient archivist learns to distinguish between a memory preserved through repetition and a memory reshaped by it, though the distinction is never perfect. Investigators in the winter of 1953 and the years immediately following didn't know which witnesses would still be discussing the case decades later. Their task was immediate and practical. They traveled, questioned, searched, and requested laboratory examinations while public pressure remained intense. You can feel carbon paper between typed sheets and hear a telephone connection crackle across a long-distance call. Information moved slowly by modern standards, and coordinating officers required letters, telegrams, and repeated explanations. A lead in another district might take days to verify. By then, another dozen tips could be waiting beneath the office lamp. The National Bureau of Investigation brought additional experience and resources, yet it couldn't restore the lost first days. Specialists could organize interviews and examine exhibits, but the core physical scene had remained unknown for nearly 5 months. You can think of the inquiry as a careful structure built upon ground already disturbed by weather, searching, work, and public curiosity. Strong walls can't fully correct an uncertain foundation. The detectives did what later generations often do with cold cases. They returned to the earliest decisions, looking for a missed turn. What they found was not one obvious mistake, but many small limitations that had accumulated quietly. The autopsy findings were reviewed as investigators tried to understand the likely sequence of events. Because time and the bog had altered the remains, medical conclusions could reach only so far. You can see a physician dictating measured observations, avoiding claims that the evidence can't support. Later readers would interpret those observations differently, with some believing KYLLIKKI's death may have been unintended during an encounter, and others seeing deliberate violence. We don't need to choose between them. The important point is that medical uncertainty prevented motive from becoming a reliable filter, leaving too many investigative doors open. The missing items created a similar problem. A wristwatch might suggest theft, while missing clothing might suggest concealment, and the absent hymn book or purse could indicate that belongings were carried away together. You can place these possibilities on separate sheets and discover that each tells a different story. Perhaps the items were discarded far from the road, hidden in a building, destroyed, or kept. None was recovered to confirm any version. Objects sometimes solve old cases because they preserve contact long after memory fades. Here, the most potentially informative objects simply remained absent, beyond every search and later laboratory. Investigators asked whether changes in behavior might identify someone involved. Did a man leave the district, sell a car, burn clothing, drink more heavily, or speak unusually about the search? You can understand why these questions matter, while also seeing their danger. People change jobs, travel, quarrel, and behave strangely for countless private reasons. Once suspicion attaches to a person, ordinary conduct can look deliberate. Detectives must seek patterns without forcing them. In the KYLLIKKI Saari case, many people displayed one troubling feature, but no one displayed the full combination of opportunity, evidence, reliable knowledge, and demonstrable action. The ditch digger's work near the burial place remained perhaps the most haunting coincidence. Members of his work crew had reportedly taken breaks close to the concealed mound, unaware of what lay nearby. You can imagine metal cups, bread wrapped in paper, and shovels resting against a bank while conversation drifts across the bog. If he knew the location, his calm presence seems difficult to explain. If he didn't, the coincidence is extraordinary but innocent. Both readings fit the outward behavior. The scene offers no preserved moment when he betrays knowledge. It gives investigators only proximity, and proximity, however unsettling, remains a circumstance. Officers reportedly believed that the local suspect sometimes tested them with suggestive remarks, perhaps enjoying the attention or struggling under it. The tone of those remarks can't be recovered from typed summaries. You read a sentence on paper, but you cannot hear whether it was whispered, laughed, muttered, or spoken in anger. Tone might change its meaning entirely. This is one reason old interview records feel incomplete, even when they contain many pages. They preserve language while losing the room around it, the smell of smoke, the officer's expression, the long pause, and the suspect's voice. Recording equipment wasn't routinely used to preserve every interrogation from beginning to end. Notes and formal statements became the durable record, often shaped by official phrasing. You can picture a witness speaking in a regional dialect while an officer converts the account into concise written finish. Nothing dishonest need occur for texture to disappear. Hesitation, uncertainty, and emphasis may be compressed into orderly sentences. Decades later, researchers see the finished document rather than the conversation. The KYLLIKKI Saari archive is large, but size doesn't guarantee completeness, because every written record is also a translation of a human encounter. Questions about the pale car continued as police checked drivers and vehicles across the region. A car seen with something protruding from the rear became part of later retellings, sometimes described as a bicycle wheel, though the original observation was less certain. You can stand beside the road at dusk and recognize how easily shapes merge. A spare tire, luggage, a branch, or reflected light might look different after one learns that a bicycle is missing. Investigators needed a registration number, a distinctive repair, or a reliable occupant description, but none emerged. The vehicle remained memorable in public imagination and elusive in the records. Road conditions added further uncertainty to travel estimates. A distance that appears manageable on a modern map could take longer over 1950s surfaces, especially at night. You trace possible routes from Merikavia, Kauhajoki, and nearby villages, accounting for gravel, bends, and the limited speed of older cars. Fuel purchases were rarely documented in a way that could later confirm movement, and many drivers performed their own repairs. There were no roadside cameras or electronic toll records. A vehicle could pass through a district, leaving only the memory of someone who happened to look up, and that memory might not be reported for days. Investigators also checked railway and bus movements where relevant, though public transport could explain only some journeys. Timetables offer reassuring precision, yet a passenger's presence still needs a ticket, witness, or other record. You can hear the low rumble of a bus leaving a village stop while an officer asks whether a particular man was aboard. Conductors and drivers search their memories among many ordinary faces. Often they can say only that the journey was possible. In a case filled with possible journeys, possibility becomes a poor substitute for confirmation. The map grows covered with lines that lead outward and then gently fade. As 1954 begins, the active search energy diminishes, but the investigation doesn't stop. Detectives revisit important witnesses, check new accusations, and compare fresh information with the established timeline. You can feel a new calendar page beneath your hand, clean except for appointments related to an old night. The forest near Isojoki passes through snow, thaw, and another spring. Physical traces that survived the first year become increasingly unlikely to appear. Human testimony becomes more central, just as memory begins its slow drift. The case is still warm in public conversation, though its evidentiary core is already growing cold. Coldness in detective work isn't simply the absence of effort. It describes the widening distance between an event and the tools available to recover it. A witness dies, a car is sold, a building is repaired, and an object is discarded without anyone knowing its value. You can hear floorboards being replaced in a farmhouse, or scrap metal falling into a dealer's yard, each ordinary act potentially removing something investigators never identified. Time performs these changes without intention. By the time a new theory suggests where to look, the relevant place may no longer exist in the same form, and the trail has become historical. The investigators kept the most promising names under consideration for years. They didn't simply choose one suspect and close the file, despite later claims that police privately knew the answer. You can understand how such claims develop. An officer may express strong personal belief, and that belief is repeated until it sounds like an official conclusion. Yet investigators themselves often disagree, especially when evidence is circumstantial. One may favor the ditch digger, another the former clergyman, and another an unknown driver. The surviving file preserves these competing judgments, reminding us that professional experience can guide an inquiry without turning belief into fact. Several people connected to major theories eventually died, taking any private knowledge with them. The local suspect died in the 1960s, never having been charged in KYLLIKKI's case. You can imagine his file being closed as a living line of inquiry, though the papers remain. Death ends the possibility of another interview and prevents a court from testing evidence through a trial. It also complicates later public discussion, because a deceased person cannot answer new accusations. The case therefore requires a moral burden alongside its legal one. How to examine a serious suspect honestly while preserving the distinction between suspicion and guilt. The former clergyman likewise remained linked to the case in public memory, long after police found no evidence placing him on the road. His proven misconduct made him a troubling figure, but it didn't supply the missing connection. You return to the timeline and find the same narrow questions, unchanged by years of repetition. Could he have traveled unseen, received assistance, or altered his schedule? Those ideas can be imagined, but imagination alone doesn't shorten the distance or create a vehicle. Patient investigation sometimes ends a line, not by proving innocence in every possible world, but by recognizing that no reliable evidence moves it forward. Other names entered popular discussion because they became associated with later Finnish crimes. When a new unsolved case appeared, similarities encouraged people to connect it with KYLLIKKI's death. You can see the appeal of a single hidden figure moving through several mysteries, because one answer might resolve many uncertainties at once. Yet resemblance between cases is common at a broad level. A rural road, a young victim, missing belongings, or concealed evidence. Meaningful linkage requires something more specific. Police considered such possibilities when warranted, but no later suspect was technically connected to the KYLLIKKI Saari evidence. One man whose name would become especially persistent was Hans Assman, later discussed in relation to several Finnish mysteries. Stories placed him or his associates near Isojoki, and years afterward he reportedly described an accidental collision followed by concealment. You can listen to that account with calm caution. It offers a car, more than one participant, and an explanation for hiding the bicycle, which gives it narrative completeness. But a complete story isn't necessarily a true one. The account emerged long after the event, shifted through retelling, and lacked independent evidence placing Assman on the road that Sunday night. Claims of late confession always present a special challenge. The speaker may know published details, enjoy notoriety, protect another person, or reshape memory after decades. You can sit across from such a statement and ask the same quiet questions detectives ask. Does it contain information never released? Can its root be verified? And does it match the physical evidence without adjustment? In the Assman story, the answers remained insufficient. No document, witness, vehicle trace, or preserved object transformed the claim into proof. It became another branch of the KYLLIKKI Saari case, widely discussed, yet unable to bear evidentiary weight. The same caution applies to stories that someone confessed privately before death. Families and acquaintances sometimes reveal these accounts only years later, perhaps because fear has eased, or because they finally understand an old remark differently. You can respect the person reporting it, while still asking how precisely the words were remembered. A statement heard once can change during decades of reflection. Without a recording or supporting detail, police can seldom build a prosecutable case from it. Such accounts may illuminate relationships or local belief, but they often arrive after every person who could confirm them has fallen silent. By the 1960s, The file no longer commanded daily national headlines, though it remained one of Finland's best-known mysteries. The road at Isojoki continued carrying bicycles, farm vehicles, and eventually more automobiles. You can hear engines becoming more common and see fresh surfaces laid over old gravel. Children grew up knowing KYLLIKKI's name through warnings and conversations, even if they had been born after 1953. The case became part of local culture, not merely an investigation. That transformation kept memory alive, but it also surrounded the original facts with sayings, legends, and inherited fear. Parents sometimes invoked KYLLIKKI's name when urging children to return home on time. The warning was meant to protect, yet it reduced a complex life and investigation to a familiar phrase. You can feel how a person gradually becomes a symbol in public speech, while her own everyday qualities recede. For detectives, symbolism offers little help. They need dates, movements, objects, and verifiable testimony. Still, the cultural presence ensured that new reports continued arriving whenever someone remembered a rumor or discovered an old item. The KYLLIKKI Saari case remained socially open, even as its formal activity became intermittent. The burial place itself became a memorial, marked so that visitors could find the quiet patch among the trees. You can walk the short path from the road, hearing needles soften each step and wind pass gently through the branches. The site no longer looks as it did in October of 1953, because trees grow, drainage changes, and visitors leave their own traces. Yet standing there helps researchers understand distances that appear abstract on paper. The road is close, the bog is uneven, and sound travels differently beneath the forest canopy. Landscape can correct imagination, though it cannot restore a vanished moment. Investigators and later researchers repeatedly visited the route for this reason. A map may suggest that concealment required a long journey, while walking shows that it was only a few hundred meters. Conversely, a short line on paper may cross difficult wet ground that slows every step. You can move carefully between hummocks, feeling moss compress beneath your boots and cold water gathering in shallow prints. These bodily facts matter when considering whether one person could move a bicycle or whether assistance was likely. But even accurate reconstruction has limits, because vegetation, roads, and drainage patterns have changed since the night in question. The bicycle eventually became not merely an object, but a fixed point in competing theories. Some believed its careful submersion showed local knowledge, while others thought any traveler could have noticed the muddy hollow. You examine the missing valves and wonder whether their removal was done at the water's edge or somewhere else. If investigators had found the valves, they might have offered another location or preserved surface. They were never recovered. This tiny absence opens several paths without selecting one. The person who concealed the bicycle understood enough to make it sink, but that practical knowledge was hardly rare in a rural community. The sock fragment became another fixed point, though its treatment in 1953 would later limit its usefulness. Laboratory staff washed it so its original colors and construction could be examined more clearly. At the time, this was a reasonable attempt to identify the garment and perhaps find its owner. You can picture the damp fabric laid flat, the brownish fibers becoming visible beneath clean water. No one then knew that invisible biological material might one day identify a person through genetics. The washing answered the questions available to that era, while diminishing answers to questions that belonged to the future. This is perhaps the clearest example of how a cold case can be shaped by time before anyone realizes it. Evidence isn't merely stored until science catches up. It is handled according to present needs, sometimes consuming or altering the material later methods require. You open an old evidence box and feel the dry paper, the object within already carrying decades of contact. A perfect chain from discovery to laboratory doesn't exist. Searchers, officers, examiners, photographers, and museum staff may all have handled items under standards different from today's. The past cannot be blamed for failing to anticipate every technology. Even so, preservation allowed later generations to ask new questions, and that matters. The sock, the pine sapling, photographs, reports, and certain personal effects survived when many comparable objects might have disappeared. You can appreciate the care represented by their continued existence while recognizing the gaps. Cold case work often depends upon this mixture of gratitude and frustration. An exhibit may be present but contaminated, a photograph clear but poorly scaled, or a report detailed but missing an attachment. Every surviving piece offers something, though rarely the clean answer a modern investigator would choose. As forensic methods improved through the later 20th century, old cases elsewhere began yielding results from fingerprints, blood groups, fibers, and eventually genetic material. Each advance encouraged renewed questions about KYLLIKKI's evidence. You can imagine a detective hearing of another case, solved after decades, and thinking of the sock stored in Finland's crime collection. Perhaps it held skin cells, perspiration, or a hair belonging to its owner. But scientific possibility must be balanced against contamination and context. Even if a genetic profile could be recovered, investigators would still need to show that it came from someone connected to the crime. The sock had been found inside KYLLIKKI's shoe, which suggests relevance, but many paths could have brought another person's biological material onto it. Its owner might have discarded or given it away before the event. Searchers or officials might have transferred material during handling. You can follow these possibilities without deciding that testing is pointless. Rather, they explain why a laboratory result might remain ambiguous. A profile matching a suspect could be important, yet a defense could reasonably ask when and how the material arrived. Evidence gains power from context, and the context surrounding the sock had become broken. The missing matching piece further weakened efforts to identify the garment. A complete sock might show a maker's mark, size, wear pattern, or distinctive repair linking it to clothing found in a home. The fragment preserved only part of that story. You can run your gaze along the rough stitching described in the report, where thick dark thread closes a small tear. Many households repaired socks in similar ways during the early 1950s, when clothing was used carefully and mended rather than quickly replaced. What once seemed personal was also ordinary. The repair reflected someone's daily life, but not a uniquely traceable hand. Researchers later searched for photographs or testimony showing similar socks among suspects' belongings, but comparisons made decades afterward are fragile. Colors shift in old photographs, memories of clothing fade, and common garments resemble one another. You can imagine an elderly witness being shown an image and wanting to recognize something familiar. The wish to help may strengthen a tentative resemblance into apparent certainty. Patient inquiry asks the witness to describe before being shown, to separate recognition from suggestion. In many older interviews, that careful sequence wasn't preserved. The sock continued to invite identification while quietly resisting every name. The pine sapling also survived as a stark and curious exhibit. Its sharpened base seemed deliberate, yet its purpose remained unknown. Perhaps it marked the spot for someone planning to return, helped hold the covering in place, or was inserted without deeper meaning. You can turn each explanation slowly, noticing how motive changes the same object. A marker suggests future intention, while a peg suggests immediate practicality. No witness reported seeing anyone return to the burial place, and no associated tool was identified. The sapling tells us that a person acted upon it, but not what that person was thinking. Photographs of the sites preserve another kind of evidence. You can study the road's width, the woodpile, the ditch, and the low vegetation around Lellulaakso. Shadows show the season and time of day when the images were taken, though not the conditions on the 17th of May. Some photographs were made after many people had crossed the area. They document the investigation as much as the original scene. Still, patient comparison may reveal distances or overlooked features, and researchers continue returning to them. A photograph remains quiet until someone asks it the right question, though not every question has an answer. Over time, official attention moved from constant activity to periodic review. A new tip might bring the folders down from storage, their paper carrying the cool smell of an archive room. You can hear a cabinet drawer roll open and the soft thump of files placed upon a table. Detectives unfamiliar with the original inquiry begin by learning its geography and its many names. They must distinguish strong evidence from famous rumor, because public memory may emphasize the wrong detail. This learning takes weeks before any new investigation can begin, and many tips collapse as soon as they meet the timeline. Some later tips came from children or relatives of people who had lived in Isojoki during 1953. They recalled a hidden object, a sudden journey, or a parent's unusual silence when KYLLIKKI's name was mentioned. You can appreciate how family memories preserve atmosphere, even when they don't preserve proof. A locked shed may have had an ordinary reason, and a vehicle sold that summer may have been sold for money. Retrospective suspicion often gathers around behavior that no one documented at the time. Police could interview surviving witnesses, but corroborating records had usually disappeared. The clue arrived carrying emotion and little structure. Other reports suggested that KYLLIKKI's missing belongings might still be hidden in an attic, well, wall, or patch of forest. Searches were sometimes undertaken when the location could be defined and permission obtained. You can imagine lifting old floorboards, their dry edges releasing dust into a shaft of afternoon light. Most discoveries proved unrelated. Rusted metal, household rubbish, fabric too new or too old. Yet investigators couldn't ignore the chance that a watch, purse, or hymn book might survive. Any one of those objects could confirm a location or connect a person. Their continued absence kept the case balanced between hope and erosion. Books, documentaries, and newspaper anniversaries repeatedly revived public interest. Each revival produced a fresh wave of tips, often repeating theories considered decades earlier. You sit with a cold case officer as the telephone rings after a broadcast, and a caller describes something heard in childhood. The officer listens, checks the old index, and finds a similar statement recorded in 1954. Repetition doesn't make the report useless, because a new name or detail may appear, but it requires patient comparison rather than excitement. The KYLLIKKI Saari case became an investigation that had to remember its own memory. That institutional memory was imperfect because officers retired, died, or moved to other duties. An experienced detective might have known why a suspect was dismissed, but the reason could be summarized only briefly in the record. You can see a penciled note, whose meaning was obvious to its writer and obscure to everyone later. Names may have alternate spellings, local nicknames, or incomplete addresses. Reconstructing those connections becomes archival work as much as police work. The new investigator must learn not only what happened in 1953, but how earlier investigators understood what happened. Every generation inherits both the evidence and the assumptions attached to it. Private researchers also entered the story, interviewing aging witnesses and examining public materials. Some worked with great care, while others began with a favored theory and arranged details around it. You can recognize the difference by watching how uncertainty is treated. A patient researcher preserves words like perhaps, possibly, and according to one witness. A committed theorist gradually removes them. Both may spend years visiting the road and reading records, but method determines what their effort produces. The KYLLIKKI Saari case invites certainty because its pieces seem nearly capable of fitting, yet the final pressure required to join them often comes from belief. One theory proposed that an accidental collision involved men traveling through Isojoki toward distant work. Decades of notes and interviews were used to support a route, a vehicle, and subsequent concealment. You can follow the account across Finland, seeing why it appealed to those who knew the men or remembered their journey. It explains the pale car and perhaps the bicycle. Still, investigators lacked a contemporaneous confession, verified vehicle damage, or physical evidence connecting those travelers to the burial place. The theory remains possible in the broad sense, but a cold case cannot be solved by the smoothness of its telling. Another theory held that the local ditch digger caused KYLLIKKI's death and received help concealing evidence. It draws strength from geography, alleged prior behavior, suspicious remarks, and the weak family alibi. You can place these points on one side of the desk and see a coherent pattern. On the other side lie the missing physical connection, absence of a reliable confession, uncertainty about his movements, and the fact that many local workers knew the terrain. The balance may lean in the mind of an experienced investigator, but it never settles under the weight required in court. A likely story and a provable story are different things. The former clergyman theory carries a different pattern. It begins with verified abuse of trust and KYLLIKKI's possible distress, then asks whether he returned to Isojoki secretly. You can understand why investigators pursued it for years, especially when a person has already shown willingness to exploit someone vulnerable. Yet the distance, transport problem, and largely accounted for evening remain substantial. No evidence places him at the roadside, bicycle hollow, or burial site. The theory explains a painful part of KYLLIKKI's life, but not necessarily her death. Keeping those truths separate is an act of care toward both history and the person at its center. Theories involving strangers solve the problem of local alibis, but create difficulties of their own. An unknown traveler might have escaped detention and left the district before the search began. Yet such a person would need opportunity, a reason to stop, and perhaps enough knowledge to locate the marsh and concealment site. You can see a car's headlights pass between the trees, then disappear beyond the bend without leaving a name. It is possible, and that possibility can never be eliminated entirely. But a suspect who remains wholly unknown offers nothing investigators can test, so the theory becomes a wide, quiet horizon rather than a path. This abundance of plausible paths is the deepest reason the file resisted closure. No single theory failed completely, and none succeeded completely. You can return to the dairy crossroads, the woodpile, the bicycle hollow, and the bog, arranging them in a sequence that seems convincing. Then one witness time shifts, one distance proves longer, or one assumption lacks support, and the arrangement loosens again. The case didn't go cold because there were no clues. It went cold because its clues pointed in several directions while carrying too little identifying detail. Patient detectives kept walking those directions until each became a path without an end. Years passed, and the physical file aged in small visible ways. Paper yellowed, staples darkened, and photographs curled at the corners. You can feel the slight roughness of a folder softened by many hands, and smell dust rising when an archive box is opened. The words inside remain fixed, but their context grows more distant. A road worker's nickname means less. A demolished building disappears from maps, and a witness's reference to a local landmark becomes difficult to place. Every archival case slowly loses the shared world that once made its notes easy to understand. Still, the file continued to be kept, because homicide in Finland doesn't simply become unimportant when years pass. New information could be compared against the preserved record, and advances in forensic science offered reasons to look again. You sit beside another generation of investigators as they lift the sock fragment from storage under controlled conditions. Their gloves are smooth, the examination room cooler and brighter than the offices of 1953. They know far more about microscopic transfer and biological material, yet they also know that knowledge cannot reverse washing, handling, exposure, or undocumented contact. Modern tools meet an object whose history remains incomplete. By the time genetic profiling became a standard investigative method, many hoped the fragment might finally speak clearly. You can understand that hope, because DNA had solved cases once considered unreachable. But a useful profile requires suitable material, careful preservation, and a meaningful comparison. The sock had passed through water, soil, washing, examination, storage, and display. Any genetic traces might belong to several handlers or be too degraded for interpretation. Even a clean profile would identify a contributor, not automatically the person responsible. The science could read molecules, but it couldn't reconstruct every moment in the object's journey. Investigators therefore approached testing with restraint. A laboratory must decide whether sampling might consume limited material and whether the likely result would add real value. You can hear the soft movement of equipment in a modern forensic room, so different from the typewriter rhythm of the original inquiry. Small fibers are inspected, surfaces selected, and records of prior treatment reviewed. The promise of technology feels near, yet responsible science is often cautious rather than triumphant. It knows the difference between detecting a trace and explaining it. In the KYLLIKKI Saari case, that difference remained the central limit. The records themselves also became candidates for renewed analysis. Names could be indexed more systematically, timelines entered into tables, and statements compared with an efficiency impossible in the 1950s. You can imagine hundreds of pages spread digitally across a screen, searchable by place, date, vehicle, or relationship. Patterns might emerge where earlier detectives relied upon memory and handwritten cross-references. Yet computation cannot repair missing interviews or uncertain times. It can reveal that two statements mention the same car, but not whether both witnesses influenced one another. Better organization brings the old uncertainty into sharper focus without necessarily removing it. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, surviving witnesses had become elderly. Each new interview carried urgency, though the manner of questioning still needed gentleness. You sit in a warm room where a clock ticks softly, and an investigator asks someone to return to a Sunday evening from more than half a century before. The witness may remember the weather, a bicycle bell, or the expression on a neighbor's face with surprising clarity. Dates and sequences may be less reliable. Memory keeps what felt meaningful, not always what later investigators most need. The remaining testimony becomes precious and fragile at once. Some witnesses had never spoken fully because local loyalties, fear, shame, or distrust held them back. A small community can preserve secrets, but it can also produce the belief that secrets exist even when silence has ordinary causes. You can feel the pressure of living near people who will remain your neighbors after the police leave. Accusing someone risks family conflict, damaged work, and lasting isolation. A witness may choose vague language or say nothing. Decades later, the social danger has faded, yet the precise memory may have faded with it. What couldn't be said early may no longer be said accurately. Investigators listened carefully for details that had never entered public circulation. A late witness who could describe such a fact might still alter the case, but the extraordinary publicity of 1953 had already exposed much of the scene, and later books exposed more. You turn through old newspapers and see descriptions of the bicycle, burial place, clothing, and suspects. Information once capable of testing a confession gradually became common knowledge. The longer the public discussed the mystery, the smaller the store of truly secret facts became. Public memory kept KYLLIKKI visible, while quietly weakening one traditional method of verification. In 2015, forensic specialists again examined the sock fragment with modern methods in mind. You can picture the evidence package opened beneath clean laboratory light, every movement recorded with a precision unavailable 62 years earlier. The review asked whether usable genetic information could be recovered, and whether any result would carry investigative value. The answer was restrained. Earlier treatment and an incomplete handling history meant that even recoverable DNA might not connect reliably to the crime. The fragment remained physically present, yet its ability to identify anyone had been worn away by time. That judgment didn't mean science had failed. It meant the laboratory respected the boundary between a test result and evidence capable of supporting a legal conclusion. You sit with the report and notice its careful language, free of promises. A mixed profile from several handlers might create new suspicion without clarifying anything. A single profile might belong to the sock's original owner, but ownership alone wouldn't prove participation. Forensic caution protects innocent people as well as investigations. The hope attached to old DNA must always pass through context, and the context here remained too uncertain for confidence. 3 years later, the once secret investigative material became available for authorized research, bringing thousands of pages into wider scholarly view. You can imagine archival boxes arriving on a reading room table in 2018, their lids lifted after decades of restricted access. Historians and researchers now had a fuller record than generations of newspaper readers ever possessed. The files revealed the scale of the inquiry, including 376 distinct investigative lines. That number doesn't describe 376 strong suspects. It describes the enormous labor of checking reports, rumors, confessions, vehicles, locations, and human possibility. The released papers also showed how often investigators had returned to the same few men. Marginal notes, repeated interviews, and internal assessments revealed strong beliefs. Though no consensus capable of becoming a charge, you can see a pencil pressing harder beside one passage, perhaps marking an officer's conviction that a suspect mattered. Such marks are compelling because they bring us close to the working mind of a detective. Yet they remain opinions recorded during an unfinished inquiry. The archive offers greater intimacy with the investigation, not a hidden verdict. It teaches us how seriously certain paths were taken and how stubbornly they resisted completion. Researchers began reconstructing the lives of KYLLIKKI and the principal suspects beyond the narrow frame of the crime. Childhood records, wartime experiences, employment histories, court documents, and family accounts added depth. You can hear the rustle of municipal registers and feel the cool air of a national archive as another volume is opened. This broader method helps explain behavior that a police summary might flatten into a label. It can reveal patterns of misconduct or establish overlooked movements, but a complete biography still doesn't necessarily provide the missing event. Knowing a person deeply is not the same as proving what they did on one evening. The renewed work also restored something of KYLLIKKI herself, whose identity had long been overshadowed by suspects and theories. You return to parish records, family photographs, and accounts of daily work, finding a young woman rather than merely the center of a mystery. Her life contained faith, duty, friendship, fatigue, and private concerns that belonged to her. Some records suggest she carried distress before the 17th of May. Though its exact source remains debated, we should resist turning every private feeling into a clue. The person in the photograph deserves more than becoming evidence for someone else's preferred story. Historians walking the route noticed again how simple the broad outline appeared. A schoolhouse, a crossroads, a forest road, a bicycle, and 2 nearby concealment sites can fit within a small map. You hold that map beneath the lamp and wonder how such a contained geography produced such a vast archive. The answer lies in the missing interval between known points. A few unobserved minutes can open more possibilities than hundreds of later pages can close. The KYLLIKKI Saari case expanded not because the landscape was limitless, but because the decisive human action occurred within a very small silence. And as we draw the next box closer, the room remains quiet enough to hear paper settle against paper, while newer researchers begin testing the old assumptions one by one, returning once more to the road, the bicycle, the sock, and the men whose names had gathered around the case like dust. That dust doesn't hide the words, but it reminds you how many rooms, hands, and winters stand between the original event and the pages now under study. The researchers begin with the oldest statements, because later recollections often carry the influence of newspapers and local stories. You can hear the gentle hum of archive ventilation, while names are copied into notebooks and placed along a fresh timeline. Every entry is checked against work schedules, travel distances, and family records. The process is slow, almost domestic in its rhythm, and its purpose is to recover a little order from decades of repetition. One researcher may follow the local laborer, while another examines the former clergyman or the men linked to a passing vehicle. Their work doesn't resemble the quick discovery often imagined in stories about forgotten files. You turn page after page, finding the same name spelled differently, the same hour estimated several ways, and the same remark attributed to more than one speaker. Before a theory can be reconsidered, these variations must be reconciled. Sometimes they can't be. The archive offers abundance, though abundance requires careful restraint, because the loudest detail isn't always the most reliable one. The researchers compare official interviews with parish papers, court records, employment histories, and private correspondence where access is possible. Each source has a different texture and purpose. A police statement records what an officer considered relevant, While a work ledger may quietly prove that someone was many kilometers away, you can feel the stiff paper of an old register beneath your fingers and notice how its ink has faded toward brown. Records created for ordinary administration sometimes carry more weight than dramatic testimony because no one wrote them with the KYLLIKKI Saari case in mind. This kind of independent record is especially valuable when alibis depend upon relatives or friends. A household may sincerely remember that someone was home, yet a dated receipt, work entry, or transport record can provide firmer support. You follow the investigators as they search for those modest anchors. Many were never created, and others disappeared through routine disposal, long before anyone knew they might matter. Rural life in 1953 left a light documentary trail. People paid in cash, traveled without bookings, and made informal arrangements by conversation. The ordinary freedom of that world later became an investigative gap. The former clergyman's movements were examined through precisely this approach. Researchers reconstructed his duties, household activity, transport options, and known interactions around the 17th of May. You can trace the route from Merikavia toward Isojoki and feel its practical difficulty beneath the wheels of an older vehicle, especially for a man without one of his own. A theoretical journey could always be invented with an unknown helper, but no independent record supplied that helper. Each added assumption made the story less testable. The painful facts about his earlier treatment of KYLLIKKI remained established, while the proposed journey remained unseen. The local ditch digger presented almost the opposite problem. He was geographically close and familiar with the ground, yet the exact course of his evening depended largely upon statements from people close to him. You can hear the dull clink of a bottle placed on a wooden table as relatives describe him drinking and later sleeping. The account may be true, partly true, or protective. There is no distant receipt or timed telephone call to settle it. Investigators could challenge inconsistencies, but they couldn't replace an uncertain alibi with proof of presence on the road. Nearness made him compelling, while the missing moment kept him beyond reach. Researchers also studied the working practices of ditch crews around the burial area. Schedules, locations, and the names of laborers helped reconstruct who had reason to be near the bog during the months of searching. You can smell freshly opened peat and hear a spade entering wet earth with a soft, heavy sound. Such work offered knowledge of drainage, soil depth, and hidden hollows, yet it also meant that many men possessed similar knowledge and carried similar tools. The landscape did not belong to one suspect. Familiarity narrowed the field only slightly, and the KYLLIKKI Saari case remained caught between local knowledge and local commonness. The burial site itself invited renewed interpretation whenever researchers walked it. They considered sight lines from the road, the effort needed to cross wet ground, and whether the place could be chosen in darkness. You move slowly among the trees, hearing wind press through needles above and water settle beneath the moss below. In spring, the remaining northern light would have offered some visibility even late in the evening. A person familiar with the area could move more confidently, though an observant stranger might also find the place. The terrain supports probabilities, not identities, and every careful visit returns you to that quiet boundary. Distance between the road, bicycle hollow, and burial place was measured again with modern maps and direct walking. The points lie close enough to suggest a connected sequence, but the order of that sequence remains unknown. You can begin at the roadside, move toward the bog, and then carry the bicycle elsewhere. You can reverse the order, or imagine a later return. Each version changes the time required and the likelihood of being seen. No preserved track shows which route was used. The map gives shape to the problem while withholding the direction of movement. The bicycle's condition was re-examined through photographs and reports because the object itself had been handled and stored for many years. Investigators asked whether damage indicated a collision, a fall, or ordinary wear. You can study a bent or scratched part and recognize how difficult retrospective interpretation becomes. Country bicycles received hard use on gravel roads, and repairs weren't always documented. A mark that appears significant may have existed for months, without a photograph taken immediately before the 17th of May. Comparison has no firm baseline. The bicycle confirms concealment more clearly than it confirms any earlier event. Even the removed tire valves raise questions of sequence. Whoever took them out may have done so beside the muddy hollow, carrying the small metal pieces away afterward, or the valves may have been removed elsewhere before the bicycle was transported. You can imagine them resting briefly in a palm, no larger than commonplace workshop items, then disappearing into grass, water, or a pocket. Searchers never found them. Had they survived, soil or location might have linked stages of movement. Their absence is minute compared with the missing bicycle once was, yet cold cases often turn upon such smallness. The bicycle's recovery in July may also have changed the behavior of anyone involved. A person following the search would know that one concealment place had been discovered and that police attention had moved closer to the burial site. You can sit with this thought without assuming the person remained nearby. Perhaps they watched from within the community, read the newspaper elsewhere, or never learned of the discovery. No reliable evidence records a return to the bog or an attempt to move KYLLIKKI. The burial remained undisturbed until October. That quiet interval suggests caution, absence, or simple inability, though it doesn't tell us which. Investigators examined whether the sharpened sapling served as a private marker that could be found again. If so, its visibility may have mattered only to someone approaching from a certain direction. You can crouch low and see how a small tree might blend with surrounding growth while remaining recognizable to the person who placed it. Yet planting a marker above a concealed site also risks discovery, as eventually happened. It may have supported moss, disguised disturbed ground, or been driven in for a practical purpose without long-term intention. The same piece of wood holds several functions, and none can be recovered from its shape alone. The sock fragment was studied with equal patience. Its color, repair, cut edge, and placement inside the shoe were all considered, because an unusual combination can sometimes identify a household. You can imagine laundry drying beside a Finnish farmhouse, rows of repaired garments moving slightly in cool air. Socks were practical possessions, often worn until repeated mending was no longer possible. A family might recognize a repair, but national publicity could also encourage uncertain recognition. No dependable owner emerged. The fragment stayed close to the center of the KYLLIKKI Saari case, while remaining strangely anonymous. Dark yarn wrapped around the sock added another layer of interpretation. Perhaps it held the material together, tied it to something, or served a purpose lost when the scene was disturbed. You examine the laboratory description and wish for clearer photographs from the moment of discovery. Was the yarn tight, loose, knotted, or simply tangled? Small differences could alter the meaning. Later handling may have changed its arrangement, and early reports don't answer every modern question. The object therefore survives more fully than its original position. Cold case evidence can remain physically intact, while its most useful relationship to surrounding objects disappears. The shoes were found separately near the burial place, and their positions might once have helped reconstruct movement. But forestry work, weather, animals, and months of exposure had affected the area before discovery. You can hear autumn leaves shifting across the ground and imagine how light objects move through seasonal change. A shoe may remain where it was placed, or it may be displaced without human action. Investigators recorded what they found. Though the broader scene had already endured a summer, location still mattered, but it couldn't be read like an untouched arrangement. Nature had become an unrecorded participant in the evidence. Soil analysis offered another possible route. Samples from clothing, shoes, tools, vehicles, or buildings might connect a suspect to the bog if distinctive mineral or plant material survived. Yet proper comparison requires known reference samples collected under controlled conditions. You can feel grains of peat and sand between gloved fingers, knowing that similar material covers a wide district. Early collection was limited, and suspected tools carried ordinary work soil from many places. Decades later, exact environmental conditions had changed. The ground could show that an object belonged somewhere wet and rural, but that description included much of the surrounding landscape. Hair and fiber evidence faced comparable limitations. A strand recovered from clothing could come from KYLLIKKI, a family member, a searcher, or an unknown person, while microscopic comparison could suggest similarity without proving identity. You sit beneath the bright circle of a laboratory lamp and watch fibers placed upon glass. Their colors and structures are real, yet their history remains uncertain. Modern DNA analysis might sometimes clarify a hair, but preservation and contamination determine whether that is possible. The surviving records don't reveal a clean, unexplained sample capable of leading toward one person. Another promising doorway remained only partly formed. Fingerprint evidence was even less forgiving. The bicycle had spent weeks under muddy water, while shoes and cloth had remained exposed through changing weather. You can hear water dripping from the frame when it was raised in July and understand why clear ridge detail was unlikely to remain. Other objects had rough, absorbent surfaces that hold prints poorly. Any prints recovered from personal belongings would also need comparison with family, friends, and legitimate handlers. The responsible person may have worn gloves, wiped surfaces, or simply touched nothing capable of preserving detail. The KYLLIKKI Saari investigation entered the forensic age with very little usable surface. Modern readers sometimes ask why the road wasn't sealed immediately, but that question assumes authorities knew where something had happened. KYLLIKKI's last confirmed location covered a moving journey, not a fixed room or yard. You stand at the dairy crossroads and look toward 7 kilometers of road, forest, ditches, and side tracks. Closing all of it would have been impractical even today, especially 2 days after the disappearance. Police could examine likely points, yet every passing cart or bicycle altered the ground. The uncertainty of location existed before any procedural weakness. There was no single scene to protect. The delayed missing person report is also easy to judge from a world of instant communication. In 1953, staying overnight with a friend was plausible, and confirming it could take time. You return to the Saari home and hear only household sounds where a telephone alert might now be expected. No national digital system could issue KYLLIKKI's description within minutes. Her family's early explanation was ordinary, not careless. Yet the practical result was devastating for the inquiry, because rain, traffic, and human movement continued through the first 2 days. A reasonable delay became an irreversible loss. The investigation's enormous scale then created a second kind of delay. Officers needed to respond to hundreds of reports, while still protecting the central timeline from confusion. You can see incoming pages stacked beside outgoing requests, with telephone messages pinned beneath a paperweight. Every credible vehicle report demands registration checks, and every confession demands an interview. Resources devoted to one direction cannot be used simultaneously elsewhere. The National Bureau could add personnel, but each new investigator needed context. Expansion brought strength and coordination, while also creating more information to organize. A quiet problem of capacity. Local knowledge was indispensable, though it carried its own risks. Residents knew paths absent from maps, recognized vehicles by sound, and understood who worked where. You can walk beside a farmer who points toward a drainage channel hidden behind trees, offering information no visiting officer could easily discover. But local networks also contain alliances, grudges, and unspoken assumptions. A familiar person may receive too much protection or too much suspicion. Outsiders can challenge those patterns, yet they may miss the meaning of a nickname or seasonal routine. The investigation needed both perspectives, and neither was entirely neutral. The community's religious life added further sensitivity. KYLLIKKI's faith, parish employment, and attendance at the youth gathering placed trusted institutions close to the inquiry. You can imagine conversations lowered when clergy are mentioned, because accusation threatens more than one person's reputation. Some witnesses may have hesitated to discuss misconduct, while others may have viewed religious devotion as evidence of innocence or moral meaning. Police had to move through these beliefs without allowing them to decide factual questions. The confirmed abuse by the former clergyman showed why silence could be harmful, but it still couldn't answer who met KYLLIKKI on the road. Gender and social expectations shaped what young women felt able to report. Harassment might be minimized, kept private, or described indirectly to avoid shame and gossip. You listened carefully to later accounts from women who said the local suspect had troubled them, recognizing both their importance and the difficulty of late reporting. Similar behavior can establish a pattern relevant to risk, though it doesn't prove a particular act. In 1950s rural life, a young woman's reluctance to speak openly was understandable. By the time investigators heard some accounts, exact dates and circumstances had already grown uncertain. KYLLIKKI's own private distress was interpreted through these social limits. Friends and family remembered moments of tiredness, worry, or reluctance, and researchers asked whether she feared a particular person. You can sit with those recollections without turning them into prophecy. Most people have quiet days, unresolved concerns, and thoughts they don't explain. A change in mood can arise from work, family, health, faith, or a difficult interaction. Later tragedy makes earlier sadness appear directional, as though it pointed toward the road. In truth, the source of her feelings remains part of the case's privacy. Poems and personal writing attributed to KYLLIKKI were also drawn into public interpretation. Lines expressing sadness came to be read as signs that she sensed danger, though young people often write about sorrow without anticipating a specific event. You hold the page lightly, remembering that private expression isn't a witness statement. Its value lies in showing an inner life, not identifying another person. When a case becomes famous, every surviving word can be asked to perform more than it was meant to do. Compassion means allowing KYLLIKKI's writing to remain human, rather than converting it into a coded warning. The final conversation with Maiju, likewise, grew heavier in memory. An offer to stay overnight, hesitation about the route, or a remark about lateness could seem deeply significant afterward. You return to the dairy crossroads and hear two friends speaking in the ordinary way friends do before separating. Neither knew that investigators would pass the exchange for decades. Maiju's recollection became essential because it anchored the time and direction of travel. Yet it couldn't reveal what lay beyond her sight. Her position in the case carried a burden no witness would willingly choose. The reported cyclist seen farther along the road might have extended the reliable timeline, but identification remained uncertain. Light was fading, distance mattered, and the encounter was brief. You can hear tires pass one another, and a greeting perhaps exchanged without either rider slowing down. Clothing, posture, and bicycle style may support recognition, though they do not guarantee it. If the rider was KYLLIKKI, the likely encounter point moves farther toward home. If not, the dairy crossroads remains the last firm sighting. A single uncertain identification therefore changes the geography without ever becoming secure. Witness estimates of speed added another variable. A young cyclist on a familiar road might cover the distance quickly, though loose gravel, wind, fatigue, and hills would alter the pace. You can place your hands upon imagined handlebars and feel the slight resistance of a cool evening breeze. 10 minutes after the crossroads could represent several possible locations. Investigators used reasonable estimates, but later theories sometimes treated those estimates as exact measurements. The difference between likely and certain narrows with each retelling. Careful reconstruction restores the wider range, even though that range makes the mystery harder to solve. Weather records may help describe the evening, yet local conditions can vary within short distances. A general report of dry weather doesn't tell us whether one shaded section remained wet or whether mist gathered near the bog. You look at the pale northern sky and notice how slowly darkness arrives in May. Visibility may have been sufficient to recognize a bicycle, but poor enough to mistake a car's color. Temperature affects clothing, road use, and how long someone might remain outside comfortably. These details refine the setting, though they don't identify a person. Atmosphere is part of the evidence only when linked to a specific observation. Sound carries unpredictably through forest and open ground. A car door, engine, voice, or bicycle bell may travel far along one stretch and disappear entirely along another. You stand near the roadside while wind moves through pine branches, creating a continuous soft rush that masks smaller noises. Witnesses who reported hearing something unusual had to estimate its source without seeing it. Investigators could revisit the location, but changing wind and vegetation made exact reproduction impossible. A sound may support a timeline while remaining too vague to name its cause. The road preserved no recording of that evening. Light behaves with similar uncertainty. Headlamps on an older car are modest by modern standards, and bicycle lamps illuminate only a small area. You can watch the road brighten briefly as a vehicle rounds a bend, then return to grey-blue dusk. A person standing among trees might see the vehicle without being seen. Someone on the road would have little time to identify occupants through reflected glass. These conditions make a passing car witness understandable and imprecise at once. The pale vehicle became a durable image because it fit the setting so well, though the setting itself made accurate recognition difficult. Researchers tried to identify every vehicle known to travel the route, but records were incomplete and descriptions conflicted. Cream, light brown, grey and pale blue can overlap in memory, especially beneath evening light. You can turn through period photographs and see how rounded body shapes resemble one another to an untrained observer. Owners may repaint cars or replace damaged parts, while registration documents record model rather than appearance at a particular date. No vehicle emerged with verified damage, occupants, and timing that matched every essential point. The automobile remained one of the case's strongest images and weakest identifiers. Stories of a bicycle wheel protruding from a car's luggage compartment developed over time, offering an appealing explanation for transport. Yet the earliest form of such an observation needs careful separation from later embellishment. You can imagine seeing an indistinct circular object at dusk, and only afterward learning that a bicycle was missing. Memory may honestly reorganize the shape around that new knowledge. Investigators ask whether the witness described a wheel before publicity introduced the idea. Where records are incomplete, the answer remains uncertain. The detail may be valuable, mistaken, or gradually constructed, and none of those possibilities can be excluded. The accident theory depends heavily upon a vehicle, while the local assailant theory can proceed without one. This difference shapes how each clue is weighed. You can arrange the bicycle, roadside marks, and pale car into a coherent sequence, though the burial method may then require local knowledge or remarkable chance. Alternatively, a local person could act near the road and use no vehicle, leaving the car entirely unrelated. Both versions explain some evidence by treating other evidence as coincidence. The KYLLIKKI Saari case asks us repeatedly how much coincidence a theory can bear before it becomes strained. The possibility of separate concealment times creates still more combinations. The bicycle might have been hidden immediately, while the other belongings were moved later. The burial place could have been prepared before or after the encounter, though no evidence establishes either. You can feel how quickly the branches multiply once chronology becomes flexible. A theory can absorb almost any contradiction by adding another trip or helper. Detectives resist that flexibility because a theory that explains everything through unseen actions may explain nothing. Good reconstruction seeks the fewest unsupported steps, but here even the simplest sequence remains unverified. Researchers considered whether the burial site had been selected before KYLLIKKI's journey, which might imply planning and knowledge of her route. Her Sunday attendance may have been predictable to someone familiar with her habits. You can hear the schoolhouse meeting ending and imagine people dispersing along several roads, making exact timing uncertain. A planned interception would require knowing when she left and whether she rode alone. An unplanned encounter requires fewer assumptions, but may make the concealment appear unusually organized. Each interpretation alters the likely relationship between KYLLIKKI and the responsible person. The evidence doesn't tell us whether the meeting was expected or accidental. The missing purse and watch might suggest robbery, though investigators found little reason to believe theft alone explained the event. A small amount of money would offer limited motive, and other personal items vanished as well. You can picture the purse's clasp, the watch's narrow strap, and the hymn book's worn cover, all absent from the evidence table. Their removal may have been intended to delay identification, eliminate traces, or simply gather belongings from the road. Because KYLLIKKI was already widely recognized and found near home, concealment of identity seems less persuasive. The missing objects continue to indicate deliberate handling without revealing its purpose. A kept object could have become a powerful link if discovered in a suspect's home, yet searches produced no verified possession. You open an imaginary drawer decades later and see buttons, old coins, thread, and a watch that might resemble countless others. Without serial numbers or family identification, common belongings become difficult to prove. People inherit objects, trade them, and forget their origin. The more time passes, the less meaning location alone may carry. An item found promptly would have spoken loudly. The same item found after half a century might whisper only a possibility. The hymn book held particular emotional significance because it connected KYLLIKKI's final known gathering with her journey home. Investigators, and later researchers, hoped it might bear a name, note, fingerprint, or trace from wherever it had been kept. You can feel the thin pages and worn binding of a book used regularly in parish life. Paper can survive for decades in a dry attic, but it disappears quickly in fire, water, or ordinary disposal. No reliable discovery was made. Its absence became part of the quiet space around KYLLIKKI, a personal object remembered more clearly than many physical clues, because it reflected her daily life. The wristwatch could have helped refine time if it stopped during a fall or exposure to water, though such reasoning would still require caution. You can hear the tiny mechanism ticking inside its case, marking minutes no witness observed. If recovered, damage might show only when moisture entered, not when the relevant event occurred. Yet even an uncertain stop time would have offered something to compare against sightings. Because the watch never appeared, investigators lost both a possible timeline marker and an identifying possession. A small machine designed to measure time became, through absence, another reminder of time's power over the case. The purse might have contained receipts, notes, keys, or modest personal items that clarified KYLLIKKI's plans. You imagine its weight on the evidence table and how carefully each compartment would now be examined. In 1953, even a scrap of paper with a name or number could redirect the inquiry. If the purse was taken intentionally, the person may have feared precisely that kind of connection. If it was discarded, searchers never found the location. The object's unknown contents create questions that cannot be answered from family memory alone, leaving one more section of KYLLIKKI's final day blank. Clothing evidence also suffered from exposure and incomplete recovery. Fibers might have transferred during contact, but comparison requires a suspected source and confidence that the fibers weren't acquired earlier. You sit with the laboratory notes and see careful descriptions that stop short of individual identification. Rural clothing often contained common wool and cotton materials, repaired and shared within households. A matching color or weave might support a connection without proving one. Modern chemical analysis could be more precise, yet little suitable material remained with a secure history. The evidence preserved texture while losing origin. Every one of these limitations narrows what a prosecutor could responsibly present. A criminal case must do more than create a strong feeling that one person fits the circumstances. You can imagine the evidence arranged before a court: weak alibi, proximity, prior misconduct, suggestive remarks, and knowledge of terrain. Each point matters, but each also has an alternative explanation. Without physical linkage or reliable eyewitness identification, reasonable doubt remains large. Investigators may privately favor a suspect, while the legal system still lacks a case. The coldness of the file is therefore partly a form of restraint. That restraint protects the integrity of KYLLIKKI's story. Naming a person without sufficient proof may satisfy public desire temporarily, but it can freeze an uncertain theory into false history. You can feel the comfort of a closed folder and understand why it is tempting. An answer reduces the number of voices and gives the road a final sequence. Yet, a wrong answer would bury the real one more deeply, while harming another family. Patient detective work sometimes means refusing closure, even after decades, because the surviving evidence doesn't justify the certainty everyone wants. Researchers who spent months with the archive didn't all reach the same conclusion. Their disagreement is instructive because they examined many of the same records and walked the same landscape. You can picture them seated around a table, maps spread between coffee cups, calmly arguing over a time estimate or witness phrase. One sees the local suspect as most likely, while another interprets the medical evidence or vehicle reports differently. Expertise sharpens reasoning but doesn't eliminate ambiguity. If informed readers remain divided after close study, the file itself is telling us how genuinely unresolved its central question remains. A medical researcher reviewing the old autopsy material later suggested that KYLLIKKI's death may have surprised the responsible person rather than resulting from a clearly planned killing. This interpretation offers one way to understand hasty concealment and uncertain motive. You can listen to it as a professional opinion grounded in surviving notes, while remembering that the original examination was limited by time. Another expert might draw a different inference from the same record. The report cannot be repeated under original conditions. It remains a narrow window, its glass clouded by 5 months of change before the examination even began. If the death was unintended, the likely suspect pool might include someone seeking an encounter rather than planning a killing. If it was planned, preparation and root knowledge become more significant. You can see how one medical interpretation ripples outward into every other part of the case. Yet investigators cannot select a theory merely because it creates a coherent psychological story. They need external support from movement, objects, or testimony. Here, psychology remains speculative because no responsible person was identified and questioned successfully about motive. The human intention at the center of the KYLLIKKI Saari case stays unreadable. Behavior after the event might have offered clues to that intention. A frightened participant may confess, seek religious counsel, avoid the road, or become unusually interested in the search. A deliberate offender may also do any of those things, or none. You review reports of men watching searches, making comments, or changing routines, and notice how broad these behaviors are. Innocent residents were naturally absorbed by a case unfolding beside their homes. Someone who helped search could be compassionate, curious, or concealing knowledge. Action after a public disappearance rarely carries one fixed meaning. The participation of suspects in searches has often drawn attention. Popular reasoning asks why a guilty person would approach the very place where evidence was hidden. Yet history shows that people act for many reasons under scrutiny. You can imagine a search line moving through brush, every volunteer aware of neighbors watching. Refusing to join may appear suspicious, while joining offers knowledge of police activity and the chance to behave normally. But this remains general reasoning, not evidence about one man. The ditch crew's presence near the grave is remarkable because of location, though their ordinary work provides a straightforward explanation for being there. Questions also remain about whether the burial place could be recognized before the sapling was pulled. Some searchers thought the mound appeared unusual, while others had passed nearby without noticing it. You stand several meters away and see only moss, young trees, and uneven ground. From another angle, the sapling may seem too straight, or the mound slightly raised. Perception changes once you know what is there. Photographs taken after discovery cannot recreate the innocence of an earlier glance. The place became obvious only in retrospect, another example of knowledge altering what the eye believes it should have seen. Public criticism sometimes focused on this missed discovery, but large terrain searches always contain gaps. Search lines must navigate water, brush, property boundaries, and differences in walking speed. You can hear a coordinator calling directions while volunteers maintain spacing as best they can. A deviation of only a few meters can leave a concealed patch unchecked. Later teams may assume it was covered because the area is shaded on a map. The KYLLIKKI Saari search was vast and sincere, yet not geometrically complete. Human search is an approximation laid across irregular ground. Dogs might have helped under ideal conditions, but scent work is affected by delay, weather, contamination, and the availability of a reliable starting scent. You imagine a dog lowering its nose near the crossroads after many people have already passed, sorting countless overlapping trails. Rural roads carry animals, workers, bicycles, and vehicles, while rain shifts scent into ditches and vegetation. Even a strong reaction would require interpretation. Modern search teams benefit from refined training and coordination, though they too face limits after 2 days. No canine path preserved the missing sequence for investigators to follow. Aerial searching in 1953 depended upon direct observation from aircraft, if available, and dense forest offered little visibility from above. You can look down upon a patchwork of fields, trees, and dark, wet ground, recognizing how easily a bicycle disappears beneath brush. Modern imaging might detect disturbed vegetation or temperature differences early, but neither would guarantee success after substantial delay. The burial place was shallow and close to the road, yet screened by the forest canopy. Technology often appears decisive in hindsight, though every tool depends upon timing, search boundaries, and knowing where to look. Had mobile location data existed, KYLLIKKI's journey could perhaps have been traced minute by minute. Road cameras might have recorded vehicles, and digital communications might have shown whom she expected to meet. You can allow this counterfactual briefly, not to fault the past, but to understand what the investigators lacked. In 1953, a person traveling alone could move without producing any automatic record. Her bicycle created no log, and her conversations left no stored messages. The entire timeline depended upon human observation. When observation ended at the crossroads, the next several kilometers became almost entirely silent. Modern evidence packaging would also have protected the sock, shoes, bicycle, and biological material differently. Separate sterile containers, documented handlers, and controlled refrigeration might preserve traces now lost. You can hear the crisp fold of a new evidence bag and the click of a camera recording every angle. Yet even perfect preservation wouldn't guarantee that the responsible person left identifiable material. The case may still have remained unsolved. Better procedure increases opportunity. It doesn't manufacture evidence. This gentle distinction keeps our reading fair to the officers who worked with the knowledge and resources of their time. The original detectives also endured pressure difficult to measure in official reports. A famous case brings criticism, long hours, and the feeling that every quiet day represents failure. You can picture an officer returning home after midnight, coat carrying the smell of rain and cigarette smoke, then waking to begin again. Investigators are human, and fatigue affects judgment, memory, and patience. Some may become attached to a theory because it organizes the chaos. Others may resist that theory to preserve independence. The archive records their work, but rarely the private weariness beneath it. Years later, retired officers continued thinking about KYLLIKKI. Some spoke with journalists or private researchers, offering beliefs formed through interviews no outsider had witnessed. You can listen respectfully to a detective who says he knew which suspect was responsible, while asking what evidence supported that conviction. Long experience can recognize patterns that paperwork fails to capture. It can also harden an early impression. Without a trial, cross-examination, or new corroboration, personal certainty remains personal. The officer's memory becomes another important witness in the case, carrying both insight and the effects of time. Different retired investigators sometimes emphasized different suspects, revealing how interpretation had varied inside the inquiry itself. You can place their later interviews beside contemporary notes and see where memory aligns or diverges. An officer may recall a suspect's demeanor vividly while dates have shifted. Another may remember why a vehicle lead was dismissed, though no detailed report survives. These recollections help restore context, but they cannot be treated as untouched records. Like every witness, detectives remember through the lens of what happened afterward, including decades of public discussion. The archive's release allowed researchers to check some of those later claims against original material. Certain dramatic stories proved less complete than popular versions suggested, while overlooked details gained new importance. You can feel the patient satisfaction of locating a first statement after reading dozens of retellings. The original may contain uncertainty that vanished from later books. It may also reveal that police checked a lead more thoroughly than critics assumed. Archival work doesn't always produce a new suspect. Often it performs the quieter service of returning each claim to its proper size. One public belief held that the investigation was solved privately, but could never be proved. This may describe the confidence of some officers, especially regarding the local ditch digger. Yet an official solution requires more than consensus among investigators, and even that consensus wasn't complete. You look across the thousands of pages and see why one suspect attracted lasting attention. You also see why no charge followed. To say that police suspected someone strongly is accurate. To say they established his responsibility would go beyond the record. The difference is narrow in casual speech and enormous in justice. Another belief held that local residents knew the truth and maintained collective silence. Small communities often acquire such legends after an unsolved case. You can walk through Isojoki decades later and hear how one family supposedly protected another, or how a secret passed between generations. Some person may indeed have known more than was reported, but a community isn't a single mind, and silence can't be assumed merely because investigators lacked proof. Many residents searched, testified, and lived for years beneath suspicion they hadn't created. The legend of shared knowledge may reflect frustration more than documented conspiracy. Fear could nevertheless have influenced individual witnesses. A person suspecting a violent neighbor might avoid speaking openly, especially when police couldn't offer modern protection or anonymity. You sit beside an imagined kitchen table where someone lowers their voice, glancing toward the window before answering. That fear would leave few official traces. If the suspected person later died, the witness might speak, though memory and evidence had weakened by then. The possibility helps explain gaps without filling them. We can acknowledge the social pressure while refusing to invent a specific secret behind the silence. Shame may have been equally powerful. Information about relationships, harassment, sexuality, drinking, or family conflict carried strong social consequences in rural Finland at the time. A witness might omit an encounter to protect reputation rather than a suspect. You can see how one omission then changes another person's timeline, creating a gap investigators interpret differently. Years later, the original reason for silence may seem minor, but the opportunity for timely clarification is gone. Cold cases often preserve not only criminal secrecy, but the ordinary private defenses people use to remain accepted within a community. The passage of generations gradually softened those social pressures. Descendants could discuss people their parents refused to name, and historians could examine records once considered too sensitive. You can hear an elderly resident open a drawer and unfold a letter kept beneath linens for decades. Sometimes such discoveries reshape a family story, though none has supplied the decisive link in KYLLIKKI's case. The later freedom to speak arrived alongside the fading of first-hand knowledge. What became socially possible became evidentially difficult, a quiet exchange that time made without asking permission. At the memorial path, visitors continued leaving flowers and standing beside the stone in respectful silence. The air there carries resin, damp earth, and the distant sound of vehicles passing on the road. You can place your hand near the cool surface without needing to solve anything in that moment. The memorial marks where KYLLIKKI was found, but it also marks the limits of what the landscape surrendered. Nearby ground gave investigators the bicycle, shoes, sock, and burial place. It never gave them the person who moved among those objects. The forest kept no name. KYLLIKKI's grave at Isojoki churchyard became another place of remembrance, quieter than the immense funeral that first gathered there. Seasons pass over the stone, with snow along its lower edge in winter and soft grass returning in spring. You can hear church bells move through the open air, their sound fading beyond the cemetery walls. Visitors arrive because the case remains known, though the grave belongs to a young woman rather than to a mystery. That distinction matters whenever public fascination grows too large. Evidence files ask what happened, while a grave asks only for respect. And when we return from the churchyard to the archive, another set of folders waits beneath the steady reading room light, containing the later tips, the forensic reviews, and the careful attempts to decide whether anything still preserved could carry the investigation one quiet step farther. Those later attempts moved carefully because the remaining evidence could no longer bear every question placed upon it. You can picture the final laboratory report returning to its folder, the paper clean and cool beneath the archive lamp. No genetic result provided a dependable path to another person, and no late witness supplied knowledge strong enough to overcome the missing years. The investigators had reached the edge of what the preserved material could say, and patience alone could not make it speak beyond that edge. The active police investigation has ended, but the death of KYLLIKKI Saari remains unsolved. No one was ever charged, no suspect was proved responsible, and the answer sought since the 17th of May, 1953, never arrived. The surviving evidence is no longer believed capable of settling the case through present forensic methods, though the records remain part of Finland's criminal history. You can hold that status plainly, without choosing a name the evidence could not establish, and without asking uncertainty to become certainty merely because so much time has passed. At Isojoki, the road continues through the trees, changed by decades of weather and passing wheels. The schoolhouse evening, the dairy crossroads, and the farmhouse lamp now belong to another Finland, yet KYLLIKKI is still remembered with a gentleness larger than the theories surrounding her. You can let the suspects recede from the desk and leave only her photograph beneath the warm light, where she is no longer a clue or symbol, but a young woman whose life deserved care. The folders may close now, softly enough that the sound barely crosses the room, while outside the pines move in the night air and the old road rests beneath them. Nothing more is required from you, and nothing needs to be decided before sleep. The question remains where history left it, but KYLLIKKI's memory can rest apart from that unanswered question, held quietly among the people and places that never forgot her. Let the lamp grow dim, Let the paper settle into stillness, and leave the road to the gentle Finnish night.